A 16-year-old boy walked into a room full of dangerous men holding nothing but a dead man's motorcycle helmet and $5 worth of desperation. The bikers inside Black Vulture MC didn't move. They didn't speak. They just stared at the faded decal on that cracked shell. Iron Veil Riders. And every single one of them recognized the ghost standing in their doorway. What happens next will shatter you, because the brotherhood that saved this boy's life wasn't built on kindness. It was built on blood, old wounds, and the kind of loyalty that scares decent people. This kid had no idea what he just walked into. And neither do you. Stay with me until the very end of this one. I promise you, it's worth every second. Hit that like button, drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from right now, and let's ride. The rain had been falling for 3 days straight across the Shenandoah Ridge corridor, turning Route 81 into a long black ribbon of reflected headlights and standing water. The kind of rain that didn't clean anything, just moved the dirt around, pooled in the cracks of old asphalt, and made the cold feel like it had teeth. Jace Mercer hadn't eaten since yesterday morning. Half a gas station hot dog wrapped in foil that a trucker left on the counter at a rest stop outside Millhaven. He'd waited until the cashier turned around before grabbing it. Didn't even taste it going down. Just chewed and swallowed and kept walking along the highway shoulder with his hood up and his brother's motorcycle helmet pressed against his ribs like a shield. The helmet was all he had left. Everything else, the apartment, the truck, the life that used to make sense, was gone. Stripped away in pieces over the past 19 days since Ryder died on this same highway, 3 miles south, where the guardrail bent outward and nobody had bothered to fix it. He could see the neon from 200 yards out, a flickering sign above a squat concrete building set back from the road behind a gravel lot packed with Harleys. The sign read Black Vulture MC in red letters that buzzed and popped against the dark sky. Half the V was burned out. Beneath it, motorcycles sat in rows like sleeping animals, chrome wet with rain, exhaust pipes still ticking from recent heat. Jay stopped walking. His sneakers were soaked through. His hoodie weighed twice what it should. He was shaking. Not from fear, though fear was certainly present, curling in his stomach like something alive. He was shaking because his body had run out of fuel and his brain hadn't gotten the message yet. He knew what this place was. Everyone along the ridge knew. Black Vulture MC ran the stretch of highway between Millhaven and Cold Fork like it belonged to them. They weren't the kind of men you approached unless you had business, and even then you thought twice. Ryder had told him stories, not warnings exactly, more like weather reports. They're out there. They do what they do. Don't start trouble, and trouble won't find you. But Ryder was dead now, and trouble had already found Jace without him starting a damn thing. He looked down at the helmet. The paint was scratched and faded, the visor cracked along one edge, but the Iron Veil Rider's decal on the right side was still legible, a coiled rattlesnake wrapped around crossed pistons. Ryder's Club. Ryder's life before Jace was old enough to understand what any of it meant. $5. That's what he'd ask for. $5 for a dead man's helmet so he could buy something to eat and figure out his next move, which at this point meant figuring out how to keep his 14-year-old sister from being taken away by people who didn't know her name but had the legal authority to decide her future. He crossed the gravel lot. Rain hammered the chrome and leather around him. The door to the clubhouse was heavy, solid wood reinforced with metal, and when he pulled it open, the warmth that hit his face felt like a slap. Cigarette smoke, engine grease, whiskey, old leather, and beneath all of it the sour-sweet smell of coffee that had been sitting on a burner too long. The room was bigger than he expected. A long bar made from reclaimed wood ran the length of the far wall. Pool tables occupied the center. Chairs and couches that looked like they'd survived multiple decades of abuse were scattered in clusters. The walls were covered with photographs, patches, memorial plaques, and road maps marked with routes that meant something to people Jace would never understand. 12 men occupied the space, maybe 13, some at the bar, some around a table near the back where cards were spread out beside overflowing ashtrays, 2 near the pool tables, cues resting against their hips, watching the door. Every single one of them looked at Jace when he walked in. The silence didn't arrive gradually. It dropped like a blade. Conversation stopped mid-word. A bottle that had been tilting toward a glass froze in the air. Even the music, some low country song grinding through blown speakers, seemed to pull back, as though the room itself was holding its breath. Jace stood in the doorway, dripping rainwater onto the wooden floor and gripping the helmet with both hands. His knuckles were white. His jaw was clenched so tight his molars ached. He could feel every pair of eyes in the room measuring him, calculating what a soaking wet teenager was doing standing in a place where teenagers did not belong. "I'm not looking for trouble," he said. His voice cracked on the last word, and he hated himself for it. I got a helmet. Good condition. I'll take $5 for it." Nobody moved. Then a man at the bar. Thick neck, gray beard cut close to the jaw, leather vest stretched across shoulders that looked like they'd been built for violence, set his whiskey down and turned on his stool. His eyes moved from Jace's face to the helmet and stayed there. "Turn it," he said. Not loud, not aggressive, just a command issued by someone accustomed to being obeyed. Jace turned the helmet slowly, presenting the right side. The Iron Veil Rider's decal caught the overhead light. The man at the bar exhaled through his nose, slow, controlled, like he was managing something dangerous inside his chest that had just been jolted awake. "Where'd you get that?" Another voice. This one from the card table, a wiry man with a shaved head and tattoo sleeves that disappeared beneath rolled-up flannel. "It was my brother's." "Your brother got a name?" Jace's throat tightened. Saying it out loud still felt like swallowing broken glass. "Ryder. Ryder Mercer." The room changed, not the temperature, not the light. Something deeper. Something in the way the men shifted their weight and looked at each other with expressions that carried history Jace couldn't read. The man at the bar picked up his whiskey again, but didn't drink it, just held it while his eyes stayed locked on the helmet. "Ryder Mercer rode with Iron Veil 8 years, the man said. Before that, he was 3rd Battalion, 7th Marines. Did 2 tours in places that don't exist on civilian maps." He paused. "You're telling me you're his kid brother?" "Yeah. And you're trying to sell his helmet for $5. Jace felt something collapse inside his chest. The way the man said it made the whole thing sound like what it was. Not a transaction, but a surrender. The last piece of Ryder reduced to the price of a gas station sandwich. "I'm hungry," Jace said. Simple. No drama. No plea. Just the truth delivered with the kind of exhausted honesty that comes when pride has been beaten out of you by circumstances too large to fight. The man at the bar stood. He was taller than Jace expected, 6'3", maybe 6'4", with the kind of build that suggested years of physical labor rather than gym vanity. His vest carried patches that Jace's eyes were too blurred to read, but the one on the front, Boone, was stitched in block letters above the left pocket. Boone Callahan crossed the room in 4 steps that made the floorboards groan beneath his boots. He stopped in front of Jace and looked down at the boy with an expression that was impossible to decode. Not pity, not anger. Something older. Something that lived in the space between recognition and grief. "You're not selling that helmet," Boone said. Jace's grip tightened. "It's mine to sell." "Didn't say it wasn't. Said you're not selling it." Boone turned his head slightly. "May? Kitchen still open?" A woman's voice came from somewhere behind the bar. "Grill's off, but I can do sandwiches." "Make it 3, and coffee. Hot." Boone looked at Jace again. "Sit down." It wasn't an invitation, but it wasn't a threat either. It occupied some middle ground that Jace had never encountered before. A space where authority and protection were woven together so tightly he couldn't separate them. He sat. The couch was cracked leather, cold at first, then warming fast. Jace set the helmet beside him and tried to stop his hands from shaking. Across the room, the other men had returned to their cards and their drinks, but the silence was different now. Watchful. Waited. Like the whole club was processing something that required more than words. Boone sat across from him in a chair that looked too small for his frame. He pulled a pack of cigarettes from his vest pocket, tapped one out, and lit it with a steel lighter that had seen more fire than most furnaces. The smoke curled upward and disappeared into the haze that permanently occupied the air above shoulder height. "When did Ryder die?" Boone asked. 19 days ago. Route 81. 3 miles south of here. I know where. Boone's jaw flexed. I rode past that guardrail 2 days after it happened. Saw the flowers, the tire marks. He took a drag. Didn't know it was him. Nobody told you? Iron Veil and Black Vulture don't exchange Christmas cards, kid. We share a road. That's about it. Jace processed that. The clubs existed in the same geography but different orbits, close enough to know each other's names, far enough apart to let deaths go unannounced. May appeared with a plate of sandwiches, thick bread, turkey, mustard, pickles, and a mug of coffee that was so hot steam rose from it like a signal flare. She set everything on the table without a word, but her hand paused on the edge of the plate long enough for Jace to notice. A small gesture, deliberate, like she was making sure the food wouldn't be taken away. Jace ate. He tried to go slow, but his body overrode his brain, and the first sandwich was gone in under a minute. He drank the coffee too fast and burned his tongue and didn't care. Boone watched without watching, his eyes directed at the cigarette, the wall, the rain hitting the windows, giving the boy the dignity of hunger without an audience. When Jace finished the second sandwich, he wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and sat back. The shaking had stopped. The warmth from the food and the coffee and the building itself was seeping into his bones, displacing the cold that had lived there for days. "Where are you staying?" Boone asked. "Apartment on Decatur, for now." For now meaning what? Jace stared at the helmet beside him. The rattlesnake decal stared back. "Rent's 3 weeks late. Landlord gave us until Friday. After that..." He stopped, swallowed. "I got a sister. Lena. She's 14. Social services already came by once. Said they're opening a case." Boone's cigarette paused halfway to his lips. His eyes shifted, not to Jace, but to a point somewhere beyond the walls of the clubhouse, somewhere inside his own memory, where similar words had been spoken in similar rooms by people who'd been failed by the same systems that were supposed to catch them. "They talked to Lena?" "Yeah, she didn't say much. She doesn't. Not since Ryder." "She alone right now?" "She's at the apartment. Door's locked. She's got a phone." Boone took a long drag and exhaled through his nose. The smoke drifted toward the ceiling where it joined the permanent cloud. He crushed the cigarette into an ashtray that was already full and leaned forward with his elbows on his knees. "Your brother ever mention a guy named Cade Bishop?" Jace thought. The name tugged at something. Maybe. Iron Veil's old president? Former. Before the club restructured. Boone's voice carried something Jace couldn't identify. Regret, maybe. Or a debt that hadn't been settled. Ryder pulled Cade out of a wreck on the Blue Mountain Pass in 2019. Truck crossed the center line, clipped Cade's rear wheel. Ryder was riding behind him. Could have kept going. Nobody would have known. Boone paused. He stopped, dragged Cade off the road, stayed with him for 2 hours until the ambulance got through the pass. Cade was in the hospital for 6 weeks. Ryder visited every single one. Jace didn't know that story. There were a lot of stories about Ryder he didn't know. His brother had lived an entire life on 2 wheels that existed parallel to the one Jace saw at home. The brother who made breakfast, who checked homework, who kept the apartment together with duct tape and stubbornness after their mother disappeared and their father became a memory nobody wanted to examine. "Why are you telling me this?" Boone looked at him, really looked. "Because debt doesn't die with the man who earned it, and because you walked in here trying to sell the only thing you've got left instead of asking for help. That tells me exactly who raised you." Something cracked behind Jace's ribs. Not the bone, something deeper. A wall he'd been building brick by brick since the hospital chaplain told him Ryder didn't make it. He blinked fast and looked away. Boone stood. "You're eating here tomorrow, and the day after. You bring your sister. May'll be here." "I don't need..." "Didn't ask what you need. Told you what's happening." Boone picked up Ryder's helmet from the couch and held it for a moment, turning it in his hands like he was reading a language written in scratches and dents. Then he set it back down beside Jace, gently, like it was alive. "Don't sell this, not for $5, not for $5,000. You understand me?" Jace nodded. Boone walked back to the bar. The other men made room for him without being asked. Conversations resumed at low volume. Someone fed quarters into the jukebox and a song started playing that nobody was really listening to. The rain kept hammering the windows. Jace sat on the cracked leather couch with a full stomach and trembling hands and no idea what had just happened to him. He looked around the room at the scarred walls and the leather vests, and the men who moved through the smoke like they belonged to a world that operated on rules he'd never been taught. He picked up the third sandwich and ate it slowly this time, tasting every bite. He didn't leave until the rain stopped. That was 4 hours later. Nobody asked him to. The walk back to the apartment on Decatur Street took 40 minutes. The rain had passed, but the cold remained, settling into the hollows between buildings and sitting heavy on the sidewalks like fog that had given up on rising. Jace carried Ryder's helmet under his arm and walked fast, not because he was afraid of the dark, but because he was afraid of what Lena's face would look like when he came through the door. She was sitting on the kitchen floor with her back against the refrigerator and her phone pressed to her chest. The lights were off except for the stove hood, which threw a yellow rectangle across the linoleum. She didn't look up when the front door opened, just sat there with her knees pulled to her chest and her hair hanging across her face like a curtain she'd pulled closed against the world. Lena. Nothing. Jace set the helmet on the counter and crouched in front of her. She was wearing one of Ryder's flannel shirts, 3 sizes too big, and her feet were bare on the cold floor. Her eyes were open but distant, focused on some interior landscape that Jace couldn't access. Hey, I'm back. You eat anything? She shook her head, barely a movement, just enough to answer. Jace opened the refrigerator. Half a carton of milk past its date. A jar of peanut butter with a bent knife still stuck in it. Nothing else. He closed the door and sat on the floor beside her. Their shoulders touched. I went to the Black Vulture clubhouse. That got a reaction. Lena turned her head an inch. Why? Doesn't matter. They fed me. Guy named Boone. Said we should come back tomorrow. Lena's eyes narrowed. Suspicious. Protective in the way that 14-year-olds become protective when every adult in their life has either disappeared or made promises that dissolved on contact with reality. We don't know them. Ryder did, sort of. Ryder's not here. The words hit the kitchen floor and stayed there. Neither of them picked them up. Jace leaned his head back against the refrigerator. The compressor hummed behind them, vibrating through the metal and into his skull. Somewhere in the building, a pipe knocked. Somewhere else, a television played too loud through thin walls. The landlord came by again, Lena said. Taped a notice to the door. What'd it say? 72 hours. 3 days. Jace did the math against the nothing in his wallet, and the nothing in their bank account, and the nothing waiting for them on the other side of eviction. 3 days to produce rent money that didn't exist, or pack what they could carry into trash bags and walk out the door into whatever came next. We'll figure it out, he said. Lena didn't respond. She'd heard that phrase too many times from too many people who didn't figure it out. Their mother said it before leaving. Their father said it before the drinking got bad enough to warrant a visit from police. Ryder said it every month when the bills stacked up and the overtime shifts at the warehouse didn't cover the gap. Figure it out was code for, I don't know, and I'm scared, but I won't say that out loud because someone in this apartment needs to pretend we're not falling. Jace closed his eyes. Behind his lids he saw the clubhouse, the smoke, Boone's face when he held Ryder's helmet, the way the man's hands, thick, calloused, scarred across the knuckles, had cradled the worn shell like it meant something. He opened his eyes and looked at the eviction notice taped to the front door. 72 hours. The next morning, Jace left the apartment at 7 and walked to the social services office on Franklin Street. The building was institutional beige, the color of systems that had been underfunded for decades, with fluorescent lighting that made everyone inside look slightly ill. He signed in at the front desk and waited in a plastic chair for 90 minutes before a woman named Mrs. Tate called his name. Her office was small, files stacked on every surface, a computer monitor displaying a screen that hadn't been updated since Jace was in elementary school. Mrs. Tate was somewhere in her 50s, with reading glasses on a chain and the expression of someone who'd been doing this job long enough to have lost the ability to distinguish one case from another. Jace Mercer. I'm looking at your file. She turned pages without reading them. Your brother Ryder was primary guardian. Deceased. Mother. Location unknown. Father, incarcerated, no parental rights. Is that current? Yeah. And you're 16. In 3 months. You're 15. I'm 16 in 3 months. Mrs. Tate looked over her glasses. You're 15, Jace. Which means you're a minor. Which means you can't serve as guardian for your sister. Which means, I know what it means. She paused. Set the file down. Is there a family member? An aunt, an uncle, a grandparent? No? Family friend? Someone who could petition for temporary custody? Jace thought of the apartment on Decatur, the empty refrigerator, the eviction notice with its 72-hour countdown ticking towards 0. He thought of every neighbor who'd heard about Ryder and offered condolences before returning to their own lives. He thought of the school counselor who gave him a pamphlet about grief and told him to call a hotline. No. Mrs. Tate wrote something in the file. The pen scratched against paper with the mechanical efficiency of a system processing human beings into categories. I'm going to be direct with you. If stable housing isn't established within the next 14 days, and if no suitable guardian is identified, we'll have to initiate placement proceedings for both you and your sister. You mean foster care. I mean placement. You mean separating us. Mrs. Tate's pen stopped. She looked at Jace for the first time as an actual person rather than a file number. Something flickered behind her professional mask. Guilt, maybe. Or the ghost of a time when she believed the system she worked for actually worked. I mean, doing what the law requires me to do when children are at risk. Jace stood up. The plastic chair scraped against the floor. We're not at risk. We're broke. There's a difference. He left the office and walked back into the cold. The air outside smelled like exhaust and wet concrete and the faint sweetness of decay coming from a dumpster behind the building. He stood on the sidewalk for a long time, watching traffic pass, breathing clouds into the winter air and feeling the walls close in from every direction. 14 days. He walked to the apartment, changed his shirt, put on dry socks. Then he picked up Ryder's helmet and walked back to Route 81. The Black Vulture clubhouse looked different in daylight, smaller, more human. The neon sign was off, just dead glass tubes in a metal frame, and the Harleys in the lot were fewer, 6, maybe 7, their chrome dull under overcast skies. The building itself was concrete block and corrugated metal with a loading dock on one side and a garage bay on the other. Through the open bay door, Jace could hear the metallic percussion of tools against engine parts, and the low murmur of a radio tuned to something with too much static. He stood in the lot for 5 minutes before going in. Not because he was afraid, because he was trying to figure out what he was doing here. Yesterday he'd walked in with something to sell. Today he had nothing to offer and no clear reason for returning except that a man named Boone had told him to come back, and for reasons Jace couldn't articulate, he believed him. The garage bay was where he ended up, not the main clubhouse door. The garage. He didn't think about why until later, years later, when he realized that he'd instinctively chosen the entrance that required work rather than charity. Inside the bay, a man was bent over the exposed engine of a motorcycle that looked like it had been through more than one war. The man was in his 60s, maybe older, with a gray ponytail tied with a rubber band, wire-rimmed glasses pushed up on his forehead, and hands so stained with grease they looked permanently tattooed. He wore a black Vulture vest over a thermal shirt, and his boots were held together with what appeared to be electrical tape. He didn't look up when Jace walked in. Just kept working, his wrench moving with the slow precision of someone who'd been disassembling and reassembling machines since before Jace's parents had met. Jace stood there. The man worked. A full minute passed. Then 2. The radio hissed and popped between songs. Wind pushed rain against the metal walls. You going to stand there all day, or are you going to hand me that 9/16? The man said, without turning around. Jace looked at the workbench, found the socket, held it out. The man took it, used it, set it down, went back to work. I know who you are. More silence. The man removed a bolt, examined it, set it in a coffee can with 30 other bolts of various sizes. His movements were deliberate and unhurried, each action containing the kind of quiet authority that came from decades of doing one thing well enough to trust your hands more than your thoughts. "You're rusty," Jace said. The man didn't confirm or deny, just reached for a rag, wiped his hands, a gesture of habit rather than cleanliness, and finally looked at Jace over the rims of his glasses. "Your brother rebuilt a '74 shovelhead from a crate of parts that didn't even come from the same decade. Took him 11 months. Engine ran like it was apologizing for ever being broken." Rusty turned back to the bike. "He learned that in this shop." Jace looked around. The bay was organized in a way that only made sense to the person who'd organized it. Tools hung on pegboard in patterns that seemed random, but were probably optimized through years of muscle memory. Engine parts sat on shelves labeled with masking tape and marker in handwriting so cramped it was nearly illegible. The concrete floor was stained with decades of oil, each mark a record of work done and machines saved. "He never told me he worked here." "Didn't work here. Came here. There's a difference." Rusty pointed at a stool near the workbench. "Sit. Watch. Don't touch anything with moving parts." Jace sat. And for the next 3 hours, he watched Rusty work on the motorcycle with the patience of a man who had made peace with time itself. No conversation. No questions about Ryder or the apartment or social services or any of the catastrophes currently converging on Jace's life, like weather systems building toward a storm. Just the sound of tools and the smell of oil and the quiet rhythm of hands that knew exactly what they were doing. It was the first peace Jace had felt in 19 days. Boone appeared in the garage bay around noon. He leaned against the doorframe with a coffee mug in one hand and a cigarette in the other and watched Jace watching Rusty for a full minute before speaking. "Your sister with you?" "She wouldn't come. Tomorrow." "She doesn't trust tomorrow, Jace." Jace looked at Boone's face. The man's expression hadn't changed from the night before. That same unreadable combination of authority and something Jace could only describe as intentional patience. Not kindness. Something harder than kindness. Something that had been forged in whatever fires Boone had walked through before arriving at this point in his life. "I'll try." Boone drank his coffee. "May's making lunch inside. Eat first, then come back out here if you want." He left. His boots echoed down the concrete hallway that connected the garage to the main clubhouse. Heavy, measured steps. The walk of a man who never moved faster than he intended. Jace looked at Rusty. The old mechanic hadn't acknowledged Boone's presence at all, just kept working, his wrench turning with the steady rhythm of a heartbeat. "Is he always like that?" Jace asked. Rusty set down the wrench, picked up a different one. "Like what?" "Like he's giving orders, but it doesn't feel like orders." Rusty paused. The briefest hesitation. A wrench suspended in air for half a second longer than mechanics required. Then he went back to work. Boone spent 14 months in a place where men followed his orders because not following them meant dying. He came back and learned that the world doesn't respond to the same language. Rusty tightened something deep inside the engine block. So he adapted, but the structure's still there. You just don't see the walls. Jace sat with that. The rain started again outside, tapping against the metal roof like fingers drumming on a table. "Go eat," Rusty said. "Come back after. I'll show you how this transmission works if you can keep your mouth shut for 20 consecutive minutes." Jace almost smiled. It would have been the first one in 19 days, but it didn't quite reach his face. Just flickered somewhere behind his eyes and disappeared, like a match struck in a windstorm. He went inside and ate. May served soup and bread without commentary. 2 other bikers sat at the bar eating the same meal in the same silence. Nobody talked to Jace. Nobody ignored him either. He simply occupied space that was being held open for him by people who understood that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do to a person in crisis is ask them how they're doing. After lunch, he went back to the garage and sat on the stool and watched Rusty's hands move through the guts of the motorcycle. He learned the names of parts he'd never heard before. He learned that Rusty communicated primarily through corrections. "No, the other way, and you're overthinking it, and stop, look, what do you see?" And that beneath the gruff exterior was a teaching methodology so effective it bypassed Jace's defenses completely. By 4 o'clock, the light through the garage bay door had gone gray, and Rusty was cleaning tools with a meticulousness that bordered on ritual. Jace helped without being asked, wiped down wrenches, sorted sockets, swept the floor around the workbench. Small tasks that required no skill but demonstrated something Rusty was apparently evaluating, because when Jace finished, the old mechanic nodded once. Just once. And somehow that single nod felt more meaningful than anything anyone had said to Jace since Ryder died. He walked home carrying the helmet. The apartment was dark. Lena was in Ryder's room, a space she'd claimed the day after the funeral by moving her blankets onto his bed and closing the door. Jace knocked. "I brought you something." He'd taken a bread roll from the clubhouse. May had seen him pocket it and added 2 more without a word. He set them outside Lena's door and went to his own room, which was a mattress on the floor of what had been a hallway closet that Ryder had converted by removing the doors and hanging a curtain. He lay down and stared at the ceiling. The eviction notice countdown continued in his head. 72 hours had become 48. Mrs. Tate's 14-day deadline ran parallel like a second clock counting toward the same 0. 2 timers, 2 deadlines, and behind both of them, the same question nobody was asking because nobody wanted to hear the answer. What happens to 2 kids when every system designed to help them is actually designed to process them? His phone buzzed. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer. But something, instinct, exhaustion, the irrational hope that attaches itself to unknown numbers when you're 15 and out of options, made him swipe the screen. Jace Mercer? Who's this? My name is Garrett Walsh. I'm with Ridgeline Property Management. I'm calling about the unit on Decatur Street. Jace sat up. The rent, I know. I'm working on it. This isn't about the rent. The man's voice was smooth, professional. The kind of voice that had been trained to deliver bad news in a tone that made it sound reasonable. We've decided to accelerate the timeline. The unit needs to be vacated by tomorrow evening. Tomorrow? The notice said 72 hours. That's Friday. Circumstances have changed. We've identified structural concerns in the building that require immediate attention. All tenants have been notified. Jace's grip on the phone tightened. There are no other tenants. We're the only ones left on this floor. A pause. The kind of pause that fills with everything the speaker isn't saying. Tomorrow evening, Mr. Mercer, 6 p.m. If personal belongings remain after that time, they'll be removed and disposed of per the lease agreement. The line went dead. Jace sat in the dark with the phone against his ear long after the call ended. The dial tone hummed like a flatline. He lowered it slowly, stared at the screen until it went black, then looked across the narrow apartment to where Ryder's helmet sat on the kitchen counter, the Iron Veil Ryder's decal catching the faint streetlight that leaked through the window. Tomorrow evening, 6 p.m. He had no money, no guardian, no legal standing, no family, and in less than 24 hours, he and his sister would have no home. Down the hall, Lena's door was closed. The bread rolls were gone from the floor. Jace picked up the phone again and scrolled to the only new number saved in his contacts, the one May had written on a napkin and pressed into his hand on the way out of the clubhouse. He stared at it for a long time. Then he heard something that made his blood go cold. Not from the phone, from outside. From the stairwell at the end of the hall, where heavy footsteps were climbing slowly toward the apartment door, accompanied by the sound of keys, not Jace's keys, not Lena's keys, jingling with the casual authority of someone who owned the lock they were about to open. The footsteps stopped outside the door. Jace was on his feet before his brain caught up with his body, phone still in his hand, Ryder's helmet on the counter 3 steps away. The hallway was dark except for the stove hood light bleeding from the kitchen and the thin line of orange street light beneath the front door. He could see shadows moving in that line, 2 pairs of shoes, maybe 3, and the jingling keys went silent with a precision that felt rehearsed. A knock, not loud, not polite either. The kind of knock delivered by knuckles that expected the door to open regardless of what happened on the other side. Jace Mercer. Not a question, a statement. The voice was male, flat, official, the voice of a system arriving at a door with paperwork and authority and absolutely no interest in the human cost of what it was about to do. Jace moved to the door and pressed his eye to the peephole. 2 men. One in a county jacket with a clipboard, the other in a polo shirt with a lanyard ID that Jace couldn't read through the distorted glass. Behind them, halfway down the stairs, a woman in a dark coat stood with her arms crossed and her face partially illuminated by the stairwell's dying fluorescent tube. Mrs. Tate. His stomach dropped. Mr. Mercer, we need to speak with you and your sister. This is an unannounced welfare check. Please open the door. Jace's hand hovered over the deadbolt. His breath came shallow and fast, and his fingers trembled with something that wasn't cold. Down the hall, Lena's door opened an inch. He could see one eye in the crack, wide and dark, and already understanding what was happening before a single word was spoken. He opened the door. The man with the clipboard introduced himself as David Kemp, County Child Protective Services. The polo shirt was a building inspector named Fenton, who immediately began photographing the hallway, the kitchen, the empty refrigerator he opened without asking permission. Mrs. Tate stayed near the doorway with her arms still crossed, watching everything with the practiced detachment of someone who'd done this 100 times and learned to stop feeling it around number 30. We received an accelerated referral from Ridgeline Property Management, Kemp said. He was writing on his clipboard while he talked, his pen moving in small, efficient circles across boxes that reduced Jace and Lena's lives to check marks. The property has been flagged for code violations. Combined with the existing case file, we're required to conduct an immediate assessment. Assessment of what? Jace asked. Living conditions? Guardian status? Whether the minor children in this residence are safe. We're safe. Kemp looked up from his clipboard. His expression wasn't cruel. That was the worst part. It was the expression of a man who genuinely believed he was helping, which made him more dangerous than anyone who knew they were causing harm. The refrigerator is empty, Jace. I'm handling it. You're 15. I know how old I am. Fenton emerged from the bathroom with his phone raised, photographing something Jace couldn't see. The shutter sound clicked 3 times in rapid succession. Sharp little sounds that felt like evidence being manufactured in real time. The heating unit in the rear bedroom is non-functional, Fenton announced to nobody in particular. He wrote something on a form attached to his own clipboard. Water staining on the ceiling above the kitchen suggests an active leak. Outlet cover missing in the hallway. Each observation landed like a nail being driven into a coffin Jace hadn't agreed to lie down in. The apartment wasn't perfect, it had never been perfect, but it was theirs. Ryder had kept it together with his hands and his overtime and his refusal to let bureaucracy decide where his siblings slept. Now Ryder was dead, and the same bureaucracy was walking through his home, taking pictures of missing outlet covers and calling it concern. Lena's door opened fully. She stood in the frame wearing Ryder's flannel shirt and a pair of sweatpants that pooled around her bare feet. Her hair was unwashed. Her face carried the flat expression of someone who'd already decided what was going to happen and was simply waiting for the adults to catch up. "Are you Lena Mercer?" Kemp asked. She nodded. "Can I ask you a few questions?" "No?" Kemp blinked. Mrs. Tate shifted her weight near the doorway. Jay stepped between his sister and the clipboard like a wall made of bone and exhaustion. "She doesn't have to talk to you." Actually, in the context of a welfare assessment, she said no. The apartment went quiet. Fenton stopped photographing. Mrs. Tate uncrossed her arms. Kemp looked at Jace with an expression that mixed professional patience with the faint irritation of a man who wasn't used to being refused by teenagers. "Jace, I understand this is difficult, but we're trying to ensure—" "You're trying to take her from me. That's what you're doing. You're taking pictures of a broken outlet cover and a leaky ceiling, and you're going to put it in a file that says we're not safe, and then someone's going to sign a paper, and then 2 strangers are going to drive up in a county car and take my sister to a house where she doesn't know anyone, and I won't be allowed to see her." Jace's voice was steady, but his hands were shaking at his sides. "Am I wrong?" Kemp didn't answer, which was an answer. Mrs. Tate stepped forward. "Jace, the timeline we discussed— Your timeline just got cut. The property company called an hour ago. We're out by tomorrow." That landed. Even Kemp paused his writing. Mrs. Tate's jaw tightened in a way that suggested she hadn't been informed of the accelerated eviction, which meant someone had moved pieces on the board without telling the person who was supposed to be managing the case. "I wasn't aware of that," Mrs. Tate said. "Now you are." She looked at Kemp. Something passed between them. a silent negotiation conducted entirely through eye contact and the subtle language of bureaucratic hierarchy. Kemp closed his clipboard. "We'll complete the assessment and file our report. You'll have 48 hours to respond before any action is taken." He paused. "I'd strongly recommend identifying alternative housing and a potential guardian in that window." They left. Fenton first, then Kemp, then Mrs. Tate, who paused at the door and turned back. "For what it's worth," she said, "I don't want to separate you. But the law doesn't care what I want." She looked past Jace to where Lena stood in the hallway, small and silent and already disappearing into the oversized flannel, like a person trying to make herself too small to be found. "Find someone, Jace, anyone with a clean record and a stable address. That's what I need." The door closed. Jace stood in the kitchen and stared at the eviction notice taped to the back of the door. The paper was slightly damp from the hallway humidity. The ink was starting to blur at the edges, dissolving the words into abstraction, which felt appropriate because nothing about the past 3 weeks had been sharp or clear or defined. Everything was blurring. Ryder's death, the apartment, the timeline, the future. All of it running together like ink on wet paper, becoming something he couldn't read no matter how hard he stared. Lena was behind him. He didn't hear her approach, just felt her hand on his arm, the first physical contact she'd initiated since the funeral. "Call them," she said. He looked at her. "The bikers. Call them." Jace dialed May's number at 10:47 p.m. She answered on the second ring with a voice that suggested she hadn't been sleeping either. "Clubhouse. Who's this?" "Jace. Jace Mercer." A pause. The background noise shifted. She was moving, walking through a room, a door opening and closing. "What happened?" He told her. All of it. The property company. The accelerated eviction. CPS at the door. 48 hours. His voice broke twice and he let it because there was nothing left to protect with composure. May listened without interrupting. When he finished, the line was silent for long enough that he checked to make sure the call was still connected. "Stay where you are," she said. "Don't open the door for anyone until morning. I'll talk to Boone." "May." "Morning, Jace. Lock the door." She hung up. He locked the door, put the chain on, wedged a chair under the knob the way Ryder used to when the locks felt insufficient. Then he sat on the kitchen floor with his back against the cabinet and his phone in his lap and waited for a morning that was either going to save them or finish what the last 3 weeks had started. Lena sat beside him. Neither of them slept. At 6:15 a.m., the sound of motorcycles filled Decatur Street. Not one, not two. 4 Harleys pulling into the narrow lot behind the building with the heavy, rolling thunder of engines that had been built for distance and modified for presence. The vibration traveled through the concrete foundation, up through the floor, and into the bones of 2 teenagers sitting on cold linoleum who hadn't moved in 7 hours. Jace went to the window. In the gray pre-dawn light, he could see Boone dismounting from a matte black Road King, his breath clouding in the freezing air. Behind him, 3 other riders killed their engines in sequence, a deliberate cascade of silence that felt orchestrated. One was the wiry man with the shaved head from the card table. One was a massive figure in a dark vest who Jace hadn't seen before. The 4th was Rusty, dismounting with the careful movements of a man whose body had been filing complaints for decades. Boone looked up at the building and found the window where Jace stood. Their eyes met through the glass. Boone didn't wave, didn't nod, just held the look for 3 seconds, then walked toward the entrance. Jace opened the apartment door before they knocked. Boone came in first. His presence filled the narrow kitchen the way a generator fills a room with sound. Unavoidable, steady, operating on a frequency you felt more than heard. His eyes moved across the space with a clinical precision that cataloged everything in seconds. The empty refrigerator, the taped eviction notice, the water stain on the ceiling, the chair wedged under the doorknob. "That the notice?" He pointed at the door. Jace nodded. Boone crossed the kitchen in 2 strides and peeled the paper off the door. "Read it." His jaw worked slowly, the muscles bunching beneath his beard in a rhythm that suggested he was grinding something down inside himself. Anger, probably. Or the particular frustration of a man who'd watched too many systems crush too many people and never developed the ability to not care. The wiry man entered behind Boone. Up close, Jace could read his vest patches. Name tape read Slade. Beneath it, a rank insignia Jace didn't recognize and a small American flag that was faded almost to white. "Where's your sister?" Boone asked. "Here." Lena stood in the hallway. She'd put on shoes, the first time in 3 days, and pulled her hair back. Small acts of armor, preparing for whatever was coming by presenting something closer to composed than she actually felt. Boone studied her the same way he'd studied Jace 2 nights ago. Not evaluating, recognizing. Seeing something in her face that connected to a map he carried internally. A map of damage patterns, of kids who'd been through things that aged them past their years, of eyes that had stopped expecting rescue. "Lena," he said. Not a question, just acknowledgement. Her name spoken by a stranger who somehow made it sound like it had weight. She didn't respond, but she didn't retreat to her room either. That was something. Rusty stayed near the door, leaning against the frame with his arms folded and his glasses pushed up on his forehead. The big man, Jace would later learn his name was Dutch, a former combat medic who'd lost his left eye to shrapnel in a valley whose name he refused to speak, remained in the hallway outside the apartment like a sentry who'd found his post without being assigned one. "Who's Ridgeline Property Management?" Boone asked. "The company that owns the building." "They local?" "I don't know. Ryder dealt with them." Boone folded the eviction notice once and put it in his vest pocket. "They don't own it anymore." Jace blinked. "What?" "Building's been on a distress list for 18 months. County flagged it for code violations twice. Ridgeline's a shell company. 3 layers of LLCs wrapped around a mailing address in another state. They buy distressed properties, run out the tenants, flip the land." Boone pulled out his cigarettes, looked at Lena, and put them back. "Slade ran the records last night." Slade spoke for the first time. His voice was quiet, precise. The voice of a man who'd spent years in military intelligence before trading acronyms for a leather vest. "Property tax is 9 months delinquent. They don't want the building. They want you gone so they can sell it empty. The accelerated eviction isn't enforceable. They skipped 3 steps in the process, but they're counting on you not knowing that." Jace looked at Lena. She was watching Slade with an expression he hadn't seen on her face before. Not trust, exactly, but something adjacent. The expression of someone hearing information that changes the shape of a problem they'd assumed was unsolvable. "Meaning what?" Jace asked. "Meaning you can't be evicted tomorrow," Slade said. "Not legally. The 72-hour notice requires a court filing, which requires a hearing date, which requires 30 days minimum in this county." He paused. "They're bluffing. They had a building inspector here last night, with CPS." Slade and Boone exchanged a look. The air in the kitchen shifted, not warmer, not colder, just denser, compressed by the weight of 2 men processing the same realization simultaneously. "CPS came with the inspector?" Boone's voice dropped half an octave. "Yeah, same time. Mrs. Tate from Social Services and a guy named Kemp." "That's coordinated," Slade said. "That's engineered," Boone corrected. He stood in the middle of the kitchen with his boots planted on the cracked linoleum and his hands at his sides and his expression hardening into something that Jace recognized from a place deeper than experience. It was the expression of a man who'd identified an enemy, not a person, a pattern, a system designed to grind people down until they stopped resisting, and Boone had encountered this enemy before in different forms and in different locations, and had never once made peace with its existence. "Here's what's going to happen," Boone said. He wasn't looking at Jace or Lena. He was looking at the water stain on the ceiling as though addressing the building itself. "You're not getting evicted tomorrow. You're not getting evicted at all until due process is followed and a judge signs off, which won't happen for at least 30 days. In that time, Slade is going to file a response with the county challenging the notice. Rusty's going to fix the heating unit in the back bedroom and the outlet in the hallway, so the next time a building inspector shows up, he finds a building that meets code." "Why?" Lena's voice from the hallway, sharp, direct, the first real word she'd directed at any of them. Boone looked at her. "Why are you doing this? You didn't know us 3 days ago. You didn't know Ryder was dead. You share road with Iron Vale, and that's about it. That's what you said." She was staring at Boone with the intensity of a girl who'd watched every adult promise dissolve and had no intention of watching another one form. So why? The kitchen went silent. Rusty shifted against the doorframe. Slade looked at his boots. The big man outside, Dutch, adjusted his weight but didn't turn around. Boone held Lena's stare. He didn't flinch, didn't soften, didn't reach for the easy answer that would have made the moment comfortable. Because your brother stopped on a mountain pass in the middle of a storm to pull a stranger off the asphalt. He didn't know the man, didn't owe him anything, could have kept riding and nobody would have known. Boone's voice was low and rough and carried the texture of something that had been pressed down for years and was only now being allowed to surface. The man he saved was named Cade Bishop. Cade rode with me for 23 years. He was my best friend. He died last spring from complications related to the injuries from that wreck. But he lived 4 more years because of your brother. 4 years, 4 Christmases. He met his grandson. Boone paused. His hands, hanging at his sides, curled once into fists, then released. The day Cade died, I sat in a hospital room and promised him I'd find a way to pay back what Ryder gave us. I just didn't know Ryder was already gone when I made that promise. The kitchen was so quiet, Jace could hear the refrigerator compressor cycling and the distant sound of a garbage truck grinding through the next block and his own heart beating against his ribs. Lena didn't respond, but something behind her eyes shifted. A wall moving back a 1/4 inch, not falling but adjusting to accommodate new weight. Rusty cleared his throat. Heating unit? Back bedroom? Lena looked at him. End of the hall. Rusty pushed off the door frame and walked down the hallway with his toolbox. He passed Lena without acknowledgement. No smile, no reassurance, no performed kindness. Just a man with tools walking toward a broken machine with the quiet intention of fixing it. Over the next 3 hours, the apartment transformed. Not visually. The walls didn't change color, and the furniture didn't rearrange itself, and the water stain on the ceiling remained exactly where it was. But the sounds changed. The silence that had defined the space since Ryder's death, that heavy, suffocating absence of a life that used to fill every room, was replaced by the mechanical percussion of Rusty working in the back bedroom, the low murmur of Slade on the phone in the kitchen, making calls to county offices in a voice that combined legal precision with the unmistakable authority of a man who knew exactly which words made bureaucrats uncomfortable. Dutch stayed outside. Boone found the chair at the kitchen table that had been Ryder's, but somehow he knew, or maybe he just chose the one that was most worn, and sat down with his phone making calls of his own. Jace caught fragments, names he didn't recognize, references to legal aid. A woman named Parker who apparently knew family court procedure well enough to recite statutes from memory. May arrived at 9 with grocery bags. She didn't knock, just walked in through the door that was now unlocked, set 3 bags on the counter, and began filling the refrigerator with food: eggs, milk, bread, cheese, deli meat, apples, a container of soup that smelled like it had been made from scratch. Lena watched from the hallway with her arms crossed, every bag that entered the refrigerator registering on her face as simultaneously needed and unbearable. I can't pay for that, Jace said. May closed the refrigerator. Nobody asked you to. She folded the bags with the practiced efficiency of a woman who'd performed this act many times in many kitchens for many people who didn't know how to receive help without it feeling like defeat. There's coffee in the 3rd bag, filters too. Your machine's the standard drip. How do you know what? Because I bought the same one for my own kitchen. May turned to face him. She was in her 50s, maybe older, with short gray hair and the kind of face that communicated more through stillness than expression. Her eyes were brown and steady and entirely free of pity. Your brother used to bring donuts to the shop on Saturday mornings. Did you know that? Jace shook his head. Every Saturday for about 3 years. Never called ahead, never made a thing of it. Just showed up with a box from that bakery on 5th Street and left it on the workbench. She paused. People tell you who they are by what they do when nobody's watching. Ryder told us plenty. She left the kitchen and walked down the hall toward Lena. Jace couldn't hear what she said. He just saw May stop in front of his sister and speak quietly for 30 seconds. And then Lena's arms uncrossed, and then they were standing in the hallway together in a silence that wasn't comfortable but wasn't hostile either. Boone ended his last call and set his phone on the table. Parker says she can file an emergency motion to block the eviction by end of business today. She'll need signatures from both of you. He looked at Jace. She'll also start a guardianship petition. Guardianship from who? From the club. Specifically from May. She's got a clean record, stable residence, 22 years at the same address. Jace's breath caught. May would do that? May volunteered 4 hours ago. Down the hall, Rusty's wrench stopped turning. The silence lasted 3 seconds, then resumed. But Jace understood. Even Rusty had paused for that. The temporary relief lasted exactly until 1:15 p.m., when Slade walked back into the apartment with his phone held tight against his thigh, and an expression that Jace was learning to read as controlled alarm. We have a problem. Boone stood from the kitchen table. The movement was slow, deliberate, the way a man rises when he already knows the news is bad and wants to be standing when it arrives. CPS filed an emergency petition this morning. Expedited. A judge signed off on a preliminary order 40 minutes ago. Slade held up his phone. They're not waiting 14 days. They're requesting temporary custody transfer for Lena by Friday. Friday's 3 days. 2.5. Boone's jaw locked. His eyes went to the hallway where May and Lena were sitting on the floor outside Ryder's room, eating apples and not talking, occupying the same space with the careful neutrality of two people learning each other's boundaries. On what grounds? Inadequate housing, no legal guardian, minor sibling acting as de facto caretaker. Slade lowered his phone. And a new addition to the file, an anonymous tip. Someone called the hotline last night claiming there were drugs in the apartment. Jace felt the floor shift beneath him. That's a lie. I know it's a lie. But the tip triggers a mandatory investigation timeline that overrides the standard 14-day window. Slade looked at Boone. Someone's pushing this. The property company, the coordinated CPS visit, now an anonymous tip the same night? This isn't process. This is a campaign. Boone stood very still. The kind of stillness that precedes either violence or strategy, and in Boone's case, the two lived closer together than most people would find comfortable. His hands were at his sides. His breathing was controlled. His eyes were doing something Jace had never seen before, cycling through possibilities with the mechanical speed of a man who'd spent years making life and death decisions under time pressure and had never fully turned that part of himself off. Who benefits? Boone asked. Ridgeline. Buildings worth 3 times as much vacant. Kids in the unit are the only obstacle. So they weaponize CPS. Looks like it. Boone turned to Jace. Has anyone approached you in the last 3 weeks offering to buy the apartment? Offering relocation money? Anything like that? Jace thought. The fog of the past 19 days made memory unreliable. But something surfaced. A conversation he'd dismissed because it happened 2 days after the funeral when he couldn't distinguish between real interactions and the blur of faces that passed through those first terrible hours. A guy, at the funeral, said he was a real estate consultant, gave me a card, said the building was going to be condemned and I should get out while I could still negotiate a settlement. You still have the card? Jace went to Ryder's room. The box of personal effects from the funeral sat on the nightstand. A shoebox filled with condolence cards, a few photos, and a business card that read, Garrett Walsh, Ridgeline Property Management, Acquisitions. He brought it to Boone. The man read it once. His expression didn't change, but Slade, reading over his shoulder, exhaled sharply through his nose. Walsh, Slade said. Same name that called you last night about the eviction. Same guy who showed up to a 16-year-old's brother's funeral to pitch a real estate deal, Boone said quietly. The room temperature dropped. Not physically. Something else. The atmospheric shift that occurs when dangerous men stop being patient and start being precise. Boone put the card in his vest pocket next to the eviction notice. 2 pieces of paper that together told a story about a company targeting orphaned children to clear a property. Slade, I need everything on Ridgeline. Every LLC, every filing, every property they've flipped in this county in the last 5 years. On it. And call Iron Veil. That stopped everyone. Slade turned. Rusty appeared in the hallway, wrench still in hand. Even Dutch shifted on his post outside the door. Iron Veil? Slade repeated. Ryder was one of theirs. Whatever's happening to his family, They need to know. Boone paused. And we're going to need more than 4 bikes for what comes next. Slade studied Boone's face for a long time. Something passed between them. A calculation that involved history, risk, old wounds between clubs that had never fully healed, and the recognition that what Boone was proposing would either build a bridge or burn the last one standing. You sure? Boone didn't hesitate. Call them. Jace stood in the kitchen holding a dead man's helmet and a business card from a man who'd come to his brother's funeral to take his home. Lena was in the hallway with May. Rusty was fixing things. Slade was making calls. Dutch was standing guard. And Boone was declaring something that felt bigger than protection. Something that sounded like war conducted by men who knew exactly how to fight one without firing a shot. Outside, the temperature was dropping. The forecast called for the first hard freeze of the season, and somewhere in a county office, a clock was counting down toward Friday, when 2 strangers would arrive in a government car to take Lena Mercer to a place where nobody knew her name, her fear, or the way she slept in her dead brother's flannel shirt because it still smelled like engine grease and the last person who'd made her feel safe. 2.5 days. Boone pulled out his phone and dialed a number that hadn't been called from a Black Vulture line in over 4 years. The phone rang 3 times. A voice answered, low, guarded, carrying the weight of a man who recognized the incoming number and understood that whatever was about to be said would change the landscape between 2 clubs that had spent years maintaining a distance measured not in miles but in carefully preserved silence. This is Boone Callahan, Black Vulture. A long pause. Wind outside. The distant sound of highway traffic. I'm listening. Ryder Mercer's dead. His brother and sister are about to lose everything, and I need your help. The line crackled. Static or breathing, Jace couldn't tell. The pause stretched past 5 seconds, past 10, into a territory where silence becomes its own kind of answer. The kind that carries either refusal or the weight of a decision being made by a man who knows that once he speaks, the words can't be taken back. Then the voice on the other end said 2 words that split the air in that kitchen like a blade through cold smoke. Come here. They rode to Iron Vale in the dark. 4 Black Vulture bikes cutting through freezing air along Route 81 with Jace pressed against Boone's back, his fingers locked on the sissy bar rail, his brother's helmet strapped to his chest beneath a borrowed jacket that smelled like cigarette smoke and old leather and someone else's history. The wind was brutal, 28 degrees and dropping, and every gust that hit his face felt like being slapped by something that wanted him to turn around. He didn't turn around. Behind them, Slade rode tight on Boone's left quarter. Rusty trailed at his own pace, steady and unhurried, his headlight cutting a patient line through the darkness. Dutch brought up the rear on a machine that sounded less like a motorcycle and more like controlled detonation, his massive frame hunched forward against the cold with the practiced stillness of a man who'd ridden through worse weather in worse places for worse reasons. Lena stayed behind with May at the clubhouse. That decision had been made without negotiation. Boone told Jace his sister would be safe, and Jace believed him not because he had evidence, but because the alternative was believing in nothing, and he'd run out of room for nothing 3 weeks ago. Iron Vale's compound sat at the end of a gravel road that branched off the highway 12 miles north of Millhaven. The property was fenced with chain link topped with razor wire that caught the moonlight in thin silver lines. Beyond the fence, a cluster of buildings, a main clubhouse, a garage, 2 outbuildings, occupied a clearing surrounded by black pine trees that stood like sentries in the frozen air. Floodlights mounted on poles threw harsh white circles across the gravel, where a dozen motorcycles sat in formation, engines cold, chrome glazed with frost. The gate was open. That detail registered with Boone in a way Jace couldn't see but could feel. A slight tension in the man's shoulders, a fractional adjustment in his grip on the handlebars, the kind of micro-reaction that occurs when a combat veteran encounters an open door in a situation that called for a closed one. But he rode through without slowing, and the others followed. They parked beside the Iron Vale bikes and killed their engines in sequence. The silence that followed was enormous, the kind of silence that only exists in rural darkness when machines stop speaking and human breathing becomes the loudest sound for miles. A door opened. Light spilled across the gravel from the main clubhouse. A man stepped into the frame. Tall, lean, somewhere in his 40s, with a shaved head and a beard cut so close it was almost stubble. His vest carried the Iron Veil rattlesnake above a president's patch. His eyes found Boone first, then moved to the other riders, then landed on Jace with an intensity that felt like being pinned to a wall. Callahan. Decker. The two men looked at each other across 20 feet of frozen gravel and 4 years of silence. Whatever history existed between them, and Jace could feel the weight of it pressing down on the space between their bodies like atmospheric pressure before a storm, neither man moved to close the distance. Inside, Decker said. Not a welcome. An instruction. They went inside. Iron Veil's clubhouse was smaller than Black Vulture's, but older. The walls were bare wood darkened by decades of smoke and sweat. A bar occupied one wall. Tables and chairs filled the center. The lighting was low. Amber bulbs and fixtures that looked original to the building, and the air carried the sour-sweet combination of whiskey, motor oil, and the particular staleness of a room that had been closed against winter for weeks. 8 men occupied the space, all seated, all watching. Their vests carried patches Jace couldn't read in the low light, but their faces carried something he could, the guarded, measuring expression of men who had been told to expect visitors they hadn't invited in years. Decker walked to the bar, didn't sit, leaned against it with his arms crossed and his boots planted wide. Boone stopped in the center of the room, his men fanned out behind him. Slade to the left, Dutch to the right, Rusty near the door. With the practiced spatial awareness of people who'd entered unfamiliar rooms before and understood the importance of sightlines. Talk, Decker said. Boone talked. He laid it out in flat, efficient language. Ryder's death, the kids, the apartment, the property company, the coordinated CPS attack, the anonymous drug tip, Garrett Walsh at the funeral. He didn't embellish, didn't dramatize, just delivered facts with the clinical precision of a man issuing a field report, which is exactly what it was. Decker listened without interrupting. His eyes stayed on Boone's face throughout, but his jaw worked slowly, the muscles bunching and releasing in a rhythm that suggested he was processing each piece of information against a framework Jace couldn't see. When Boone finished, the room was quiet for 15 seconds, long enough for Jace to hear a pipe ticking somewhere in the wall and the faint whistle of wind pushing through a gap in the window frame behind the bar. Ryder died 19 days ago, Decker said. Nobody told me. Nobody told us either. He was one of mine. He rode with this club for 8 years. He rebuilt bikes in our shop. He sat at this bar. Decker stopped. His arms unfolded. His hands went to the bar surface behind him and gripped the wood until his knuckles whitened. Why didn't someone tell me? Because he left the club 3 years ago, a voice said from the back table. Jace turned. A man older than Decker, late 50s, white hair cropped military short, a scar running from his left ear to the corner of his mouth, was sitting with a glass of whiskey he hadn't touched. He gave back his patch, walked away clean. That was his choice. His choice doesn't change what he was to this club, Harlan. No, but it changes what we owed him after. Harlan picked up his whiskey, studied the amber through the dim light. He left because he disagreed with the direction we were heading, made that clear to everyone in this room. Some of us took that personally. Decker turned to face Harlan with an expression that carried the particular tension of an old argument being reopened in front of outsiders, a breach of internal protocol that both men recognized and neither seemed willing to prevent. He left because his brother and sister needed him more than the road did, Decker said, and we should have been there when he died. That's the end of it. That's the beginning of it, Harlan corrected. He set the whiskey down untouched. You want to ride with Black Vulture. You want to stand up for Ryder's family. Fine, but before you make promises with this club's name on them, there's something you need to hear. The room shifted, not physically. Something in the way the Iron Veil men adjusted their weight, the way eyes moved to Harlan and then away, the way Decker's jaw locked in a manner that suggested he knew what was coming and had been hoping it wouldn't come. Jace felt it, that atmospheric compression that precedes revelation. The moment before a word is spoken that changes the shape of everything said before it. Ryder didn't leave because of the kids, Harlan said. He was looking at Boone now, not Decker. He left because he found out what Ridgeline Property Management really was. The silence that followed was different from the others. Denser, colder, like the air itself had been replaced with something that didn't carry sound as well. Boone's expression didn't change, but his weight shifted forward, 1 inch, maybe 2, onto the balls of his feet. The shift of a man preparing for impact. 3 years ago, Harlan continued, Iron Vale was in financial trouble. Dues weren't covering the property taxes. The compound was facing seizure. A man named Victor Dane approached Decker with a proposal. Ridgeline would purchase the compound, lease it back to the club at reduced cost, and in return, Iron Vale would provide enforcement services. Harlan paused. Let the words sit in the air. Specifically, Iron Vale riders would visit properties Ridgeline was trying to flip and encourage the tenants to leave. Jace's blood went cold. Not a metaphor. An actual physiological response. Vasoconstriction, the narrowing of blood vessels in the extremities, the body's ancient reaction to threat. His hands went numb inside the borrowed jacket's pockets. His vision narrowed to a point centered on Harlan's scarred face. We didn't hurt anyone, Decker said. Fast. Too fast. The speed of a denial that had been rehearsed. We showed up, we made noise, we looked dangerous, people left. That was the arrangement. And the building on Decatur Street? Boone's voice was low, controlled, the sound of a man holding something back by force of will alone. Decker didn't answer. Harlan did. Ridgeline acquired the Decatur property 18 months ago. Iron Vale riders visited 4 times, knocked on doors, sat in the parking lot, revved engines at 2 in the morning. He paused. Every tenant left within 6 weeks, except one family. A man named Ryder Mercer and his 2 younger siblings. He wouldn't move. The room contracted. Jace felt his lungs compress. He was hearing something that was rearranging the architecture of everything he'd understood about his brother's life, his brother's death, and the men he'd walked into this building to ask for help. Ryder recognized us, Decker said. His voice had changed. The authority was gone. What remained was something rawer, the sound of a man confessing not to a judge but to a dead man's brother. He walked up to one of our bikes outside his building and said, I know who you are, and I know who sent you. Go home. He wasn't afraid. He was... Decker's hands tightened on the bar. He was disgusted. So he confronted you, Boone said, and then he quit the club. He came here the next day, walked into this room, took off his vest and laid it on this bar. Said he wouldn't ride with men who scared families out of their homes for a real estate company. Said if we wanted to keep the compound that badly, we could keep it without him. Jace's vision blurred. He blinked hard and fast and willed his body to stay vertical because the floor was tilting beneath him and the walls were leaning in and every molecule of air in the room felt like it was vibrating at a frequency designed to break things. Ryder left his club because they were working for the same company that was now trying to take his siblings home. The club he loved, the brothers he rode with, the life he'd built on 2 wheels. He'd surrendered all of it to protect Jace and Lena from a threat they never knew existed. And now that company was finishing what it started, with Ryder dead and the club he'd abandoned standing in this room pretending to be allies. You knew. Jace's voice came out cracked and raw and barely audible. Every head in the room turned toward him. You knew who Ridgeline was. You knew what they were doing to our building. You knew why Ryder left. And you're standing here acting like you want to help. Decker opened his mouth. You scared people out of their homes, Jace continued. His voice was rising now, gaining force from a fuel source he didn't know he had. You drove to our street, our building. You terrorized our neighbors. And Ryder, the guy whose family you're now pretending to care about, he's the one who told you to stop. He gave up everything, his club, his brothers, his whole life, because of you. The room was absolute silence. 8 Iron Vale men sat without moving. Boone stood in the center of the floor with his hands at his sides and his jaw locked so tight the veins in his neck were visible. Slade's eyes were moving between Decker and the door. Dutch hadn't shifted, but his single eye was fixed on the room with the focused intensity of a man calculating angles and exits. Rusty spoke from the doorway. The first words he'd said since entering the compound. Quiet. Flat. Carrying the weight of 60-some years of watching men make decisions they couldn't unmake. Did Ridgeline kill him? The question landed like a mortar round. Nobody breathed, nobody moved. The ticking pipe went silent. The wind outside stopped pushing through the gap in the window. Every sound in the world paused for 3 seconds, while Rusty's question hung in the amber light and demanded an answer that nobody in the room was prepared to give. Decker's face changed, not all at once. Slowly, like a mask dissolving from the inside out, revealing something beneath it that was uglier and more human than the composed president who'd stood against the bar giving measured answers. His eyes widened by a fraction. His grip on the bar shifted, and his breathing, which had been controlled throughout, steady, metered, broke rhythm. The accident report said loss of control, Decker said. Wet road, excessive speed, single vehicle. That's what the report said, Rusty repeated, not agreeing, reflecting. But Ryder Mercer never rode too fast for conditions, Harlan said from the back table. He was staring at his untouched whiskey with the expression of a man who'd been carrying something for weeks and had just decided to set it down. I trained him myself. He was the most disciplined rider I ever put on 2 wheels. He didn't make speed errors, not in rain, not in snow, not on Route 81, which he'd ridden 1,000 times in every kind of weather. Boone turned to Harlan. What are you saying? Harlan looked up. His scar caught the light in a way that made it look fresh, red, still bleeding. I'm saying I went to that guardrail 2 days after he died. The one that bends outward. The one nobody fixed. He paused. There were tire marks, 2 sets. One from Ryder's bike, one from a vehicle that was behind him. The second set showed acceleration into the curve. Not braking, acceleration. The room tilted. Jace grabbed the back of a chair because his legs were failing and his vision was tunneling, and the words Harlan was saying were reconstructing the last moments of his brother's life into something that wasn't an accident. It was something else. Something with a shape and a cause and a person behind it who made a decision on a wet road at night to push a motorcycle toward a guardrail that was already bent from previous impacts. You're saying someone ran him off the road, Boone said. I'm saying the evidence is consistent with that. And you didn't report it. Harlan's silence was its own kind of testimony. He picked up the whiskey and this time he drank it, all of it, set the glass down with a click that echoed off the wooden walls. To who? Harlan said. County Sheriff's Office takes the accident report at face value. State police won't reopen without cause. And if I walk in there and tell them a real estate company murdered a former motorcycle club member to clear a property, they're going to look at my vest and my record and my face, and they're going to file it exactly where you think they'll file it. Decker pushed off the bar. He crossed the room toward Jace and stopped 3 feet away. Close enough for Jace to see the things living behind the man's eyes. Guilt, grief, rage, and the particular self-loathing of a man who understood that the choices he'd made had set in motion a chain of events that ended with a rider dead on wet asphalt. I can't undo what happened, Decker said. His voice was stripped of everything except exhaustion. I can't undo the deal with Ridgeline. I can't undo what we did to those buildings. I can't undo what Ryder saw when he looked at us. He paused. But I can stand in front of his brother and tell him the truth, which is that if Victor Dane killed Ryder Mercer, then I'm the one who put him in Dane's path, and I will carry that until they put me in the ground. Jace looked at this man, this stranger wearing the same insignia his brother used to wear, and felt something open inside him that was too large and too dark to be called anger. It was the void left behind when a story you've been telling yourself about your brother's death, an accident, random, meaningless, the kind of thing that happens on wet roads to anyone, collapses and is replaced by a story with villains and motives and a conspiracy that reaches from a real estate office to a county road to a guardrail that nobody fixed because nobody was supposed to survive it. Boone, Jace said. Boone looked at him. Did you know? The question was simple. The weight behind it was not. Because if Boone had known, if any piece of this machinery had been visible to the man who'd fed Jace sandwiches and fixed his sister's heater and talked about Cade Bishop and debts that outlived the dead, then everything Jace had allowed himself to feel in the past 48 hours was a lie. And he was done with lies. Boone met his eyes, didn't blink, didn't look away. held the stare with the absolute stillness of a man who understood that his next words would either build or destroy the only trust this boy had left. "No," Boone said. "I didn't know." Jace searched his face, looked for the flicker, the tell, the micro-expression that would betray deception. He found nothing. Just a man standing in a room full of broken truths with his hands at his sides and his jaw set, and his eyes carrying the particular kind of fury that comes from learning you've been helping a kid whose brother may have been murdered by the same people you're fighting against. "Okay," Jace said. That was all. One word. But it redrew the lines in the room. Black Vulture on one side with Jace at its center, Iron Veil scattered across the other side with guilt draped over them like smoke. Boone turned back to Decker. When he spoke, his voice was the lowest Jace had heard it, barely above a whisper, but it carried through the room like a blade through paper. "You have one chance, right now, in this room, to make this right. Tell me how. You end the contract with Ridgeline, tonight. You provide Slade with every document, every communication, every financial record between this club and Victor Dane. Every property you visited, every tenant you intimidated, every dollar that changed hands." Boone paused. "And then you ride with us to Decatur Street, and you stand in front of Ryder's sister, and you tell her what you did." Decker's face went white. Not pale. White. The color of a man who'd just been asked to do the one thing that terrified him more than prison or violence or death. Face the consequence of his actions in the form of a 14-year-old girl wearing her dead brother's flannel shirt. "She deserves that," Boone said. "And you know it." Decker stood in the amber light of his own clubhouse, surrounded by the men who'd followed him into a deal that stained everything it touched. He looked at Harlan, at the other riders, at the wall behind the bar where a row of memorial plaques carried the names of fallen brothers, and where Ryder Mercer's name was conspicuously absent because the club had been too ashamed to add it after the way he left. "Harlan," Decker said. "Yeah." "Get the files." Harlan stood, walked to a door at the back of the clubhouse, disappeared inside. When he returned 4 minutes later, he carried a cardboard box that looked like it weighed nothing but contained the kind of information that could dismantle a company, end careers, and reopen a death investigation that the county had been perfectly happy to close. He set the box on the bar. Slade moved forward and began sorting through the contents with the focused efficiency of a man who'd processed intelligence materials before and knew exactly what he was looking for. Contracts, financial records, property transaction documents, communication logs. Each one examined, photographed with his phone, and placed back in the box in a sequence that would later form the skeleton of a legal case that no county official could ignore. Boone watched Slade work. Then he pulled out his phone and dialed. "Parker, it's Boone. We've got documentation that Ridgeline Property Management used an MC as enforcement muscle to clear tenants from buildings across the county. One of those tenants was Ryder Mercer. There's physical evidence at the Route 81 crash site suggesting his death wasn't an accident." He paused. "I need you to contact the state police. Not county. State. And I need you to file an amended guardianship petition for Lena Mercer that includes evidence of a coordinated campaign by the property owner to remove the family through harassment, false CPS reports, and potentially lethal force." He hung up. The room was still. Decker stood with his hands on the bar, staring at the box of files that represented 3 years of decisions he couldn't take back. Harlan sat in his chair with his empty whiskey glass. The other Iron Veil riders occupied their seats with the heavy silence of men who'd just watched their club's darkest chapter get pulled into the light and handed to strangers. Jace stood in the center of it all, 15 years old, holding a dead man's helmet, standing in the clubhouse where his brother once belonged, surrounded by men who'd either failed Ryder or were trying to make it right, and holding in his chest a truth that was too large and too sharp to process, that his brother might not have died in an accident, that the same company trying to take his home might have taken his brother's life, and that the only people standing between him and the machinery trying to grind him down were a collection of scarred, damaged, guilt-ridden men on motorcycles who couldn't agree on anything except that what happened to Ryder Mercer was wrong. "We ride to Decatur at first light," Boone said. He wasn't asking. Black Vulture, Iron Veil, together. Decker's people bring the files. We meet Parker at the apartment, and then we go to the county with everything. Decker nodded, once. The nod of a man stepping off a cliff he'd been standing on for 3 years. One more thing, Boone said. He walked to the wall behind the bar, to the memorial plaques. He ran his hand across the empty space at the bottom, the space where a name should have been. Then he turned to Decker, put his name on the wall. Decker stared at the empty space. His throat worked, his hands curled at his sides. Now, Boone said. Decker went behind the bar, pulled open a drawer, took out a soldering iron and a small brass plate, the kind kept on hand for exactly this purpose, for the day when a brother's name needs to be added to the record. He plugged the iron into an outlet beneath the bar and waited for it to heat, and in the minutes that passed while the element glowed orange, nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The only sound was the hum of the iron warming and the distant ticking of the pipe in the wall and the breathing of men who understood that what they were about to witness was not a ceremony but a correction. Decker burned the name into the brass with hands that shook slightly, Ryder Mercer, and mounted the plate at the bottom of the wall. The screws bit into the old wood with a sound like teeth finding bone. When it was done, he stepped back and looked at it, and his eyes were wet and he made no attempt to hide it. Jace stared at his brother's name on a wall in a room full of men who'd wronged him and were now trying to make it right through acts that couldn't undo the past but could reshape the future. The brass caught the amber light. The letters were uneven, burned by trembling hands, imperfect in a way that felt more honest than precision would have. He wanted to feel something clean. Forgiveness, maybe. Or rage. Something with edges he could hold. Instead, he felt the same thing he'd felt every day since Ryder died. A hollowness so vast it had its own weather, its own gravity, its own seasons of grief that cycled through him without warning or pattern. But standing in that room, looking at that name, he also felt something new, small, fragile. Dangerous in the way that hope is dangerous when you've been taught that hoping is just the first step toward being disappointed. He felt like fighting back. Outside, the temperature hit 22 degrees. Frost spread across the motorcycles in the lot like white fire consuming chrome. And somewhere between Mill Haven and Cold Fork, on a stretch of Route 81 where a guardrail bent outward and 2 sets of tire marks told a story nobody had been willing to read, the wind carried the smell of frozen asphalt and gasoline and the ghost of a rider who'd given up everything for 2 kids who were only now beginning to understand the size of what he'd sacrificed. Dawn was 4 hours away, and when it came, 30 men on motorcycles would ride south together for the first time in years. 2 clubs bound not by alliance but by guilt and grief, and the shared recognition that a dead man's family was being hunted by people who believed that orphan children were easier to erase than to fight. They were about to learn otherwise. They came down Route 81 like thunder rolling through a cathedral. 26 motorcycles in staggered formation, headlights cutting through pre-dawn fog that clung to the highway like smoke from a fire nobody could find. Black Vulture in front, Boone at the point, Slade on his left, Dutch holding the right flank with his single eye fixed on the road ahead like a scope finding range. Behind them, Iron Veil rode in a tight column led by Decker, their engines adding a deeper register to the convoy's growl, a harmonic that hadn't existed on this stretch of highway in 4 years. Jace rode behind Boone. Same position as the ride up, same grip on the sissy bar rail, same helmet strapped to his chest. But the boy who'd pressed against Boone's back 6 hours ago was not the same boy riding now. That boy had been afraid and desperate and clinging to a dead man's memory. This one was something else. Something that had been forged in the amber light of Iron Veil's clubhouse between midnight and 4 a.m., while men confessed their sins and a brass plate was screwed into a wooden wall. The fog broke as they descended the ridge above Millhaven. The town appeared below them, a grid of streetlights and dark buildings and intersections that blinked yellow at 5:30 in the morning because nobody was expected to be moving at this hour. Nobody except 26 riders and the ghosts they carried. Boone's phone had vibrated twice during the ride. He hadn't answered. Slade's phone was off. The plan was simple in the way that plans made by combat veterans are simple. Linear, sequential, dependent on timing rather than complexity. Arrive at Decatur Street, secure the apartment, meet Parker, deliver the files to state police, block the CPS order. Everything after that was improvisation, which was fine, because the men executing the plan had spent their lives improvising under pressure that would break civilian minds like dry wood. They turned onto Decatur Street at 5:48 a.m., and everything went wrong. The county car was already there, a white sedan with government plates parked directly in front of the building's entrance. Beside it, a dark SUV with tinted windows and a Ridgeline Property Management decal on the driver's door. Two figures stood on the sidewalk near the building's entrance: David Kemp, the CPS worker, and a woman Jace didn't recognize in a black coat carrying a leather portfolio. Behind them, leaning against the SUV with his arms crossed and his phone in his hand, was a man in a charcoal overcoat whose face Jace had never seen, but whose name he already knew from a business card that was now sitting in Boone's vest pocket. Garrett Walsh. Boone killed his engine. The other bikes followed in a cascade of dying thunder that left the street in sudden, brutal silence. The fog was thinner down here, but the cold was worse. A wet, penetrating cold that sat on the skin and wouldn't move. Walsh looked up from his phone. His expression shifted as the bikers dismounted. First surprise, then calculation, then something he rearranged into professional composure with the speed of a man who'd been trained to control rooms through body language and tone. He straightened, buttoned his overcoat, slid his phone into his pocket with a deliberate motion that suggested he was accustomed to having the upper hand and was not prepared for 26 men in leather vests arriving at dawn. Boone walked toward the building. Not fast, not slow. The measured pace of a man who understood that speed communicated urgency, and urgency communicated weakness, and he intended to communicate neither. "Mr. Callahan," Walsh stepped forward. His voice carried the same smooth professionalism Jace remembered from the phone call. Polished, reasonable, the voice of a system operating exactly as designed. "I don't know what you think is happening here, but this is a lawful custody proceeding supervised by county social services. Your presence is—" "My presence is a lot of things," Boone said. He stopped 3 feet from Walsh, close enough for the property man to smell the road on his jacket, cold air, exhaust, leather, the particular scent of a man who'd ridden through freezing darkness for hours without stopping. "Unwelcome isn't one of them." Walsh's eyes moved past Boone to the line of motorcycles and the men standing beside them. His jaw tightened fractionally. He turned to Kemp. "David, I'd suggest—" "David doesn't work for you," Boone said. "Do you, David?" Kemp stood on the sidewalk with his clipboard pressed against his chest like a shield. His eyes bounced between Walsh and Boone with the panicked frequency of a man who just realized he was standing between forces he couldn't control. "I'm here pursuant to a court order," Kemp said. His voice was steady, but his hands weren't. "Judge Calloway signed a temporary custody transfer for Lena Mercer. It's effective as of 6 a.m. today." "What judge signs a custody order at—" Boone turned to Slade. Slade was already on his phone. He walked 10 feet away and spoke in rapid, low tones that Jace couldn't hear. The conversation lasted 90 seconds. When Slade came back, his face carried the expression Jace had learned to recognize as controlled alarm compressed into professional flatness. "Emergency night session, filed at 11 p.m., signed by midnight, ex parte. No opposing counsel present." Slade looked at Boone. "Parker wasn't notified." "Because there's no guardian of record to notify," Walsh said. He was regaining his composure, finding his footing on the legal ground he'd carefully prepared. "These children have no legal representative, no family, no guardian. The county has a mandate. The county has a puppet," Decker said. Everyone turned. The Iron Veil president had dismounted and was walking toward the group with the deliberate stride of a man who'd decided to stop standing at the edge of things. His riders flanked him. 8 men in vests carrying a rattlesnake insignia that Walsh clearly didn't recognize but that carried enough visual weight to make the property man take a half-step backward. "Who are you?" Walsh asked. "Someone who knows exactly what Ridgeline does to buildings and the people inside them." Decker stopped beside Boone. The two men stood shoulder to shoulder, clubs that hadn't shared the same sidewalk in 4 years now occupying the same 3 feet of concrete like they'd been built for this specific formation. "I know because my club helped you do it. 12 properties, 47 tenants displaced. All in this county. All in the last 3 years." Walsh's composure fractured. Not dramatically, just a hairline crack that ran through his expression like a fault line shifting. The twitch of his left eye, the micro-adjustment of his weight backward, the way his hand moved toward his phone pocket before stopping. I don't know what you're... I have the files, Slade said. He held up his phone. Contracts between Ridgeline Property Management and Iron Vale. MC. Payment records. Property addresses. Communication logs between Victor Dane and club leadership detailing specific intimidation tactics. All of it photographed and forwarded to a criminal defense attorney named Parker, who is currently on the phone with the State Police Bureau of Investigation. Walsh's face went white. Not the white of fear, the white of calculation collapsing, of a machine encountering variables it wasn't designed to process. He looked at Kemp. The CPS worker was standing very still, his clipboard lowered, his eyes fixed on Walsh with an expression that was rapidly transitioning from professional cooperation to professional distance. "David," Walsh said, "the order is signed. Execute it." Kemp didn't move. "David, I'm not entering that building," Kemp said quietly. "Not until I understand what's happening here." "What's happening is a lawful..." "What's happening," Boone said, stepping forward until his chest was close enough to Walsh's face that the property man had to tilt his head back to maintain eye contact, "is that you used a county agency to manufacture a custody case against 2 orphaned children so you could clear a building you intend to flip. You filed a false drug tip to accelerate the timeline. You sent an inspector with CPS to create a paper trail. And you got a judge to sign an emergency order at midnight without notifying opposing counsel because there was no counsel to notify." Boone's voice was barely above a whisper. "And now you're standing on a sidewalk at dawn trying to take a 14-year-old girl from the only home she has left." Walsh's hand went to his phone. This time he pulled it out. "I'm calling the police." "Good," Boone said. "Tell them to bring a detective." The standoff lasted 14 minutes. Walsh retreated to his SUV and made 3 phone calls in rapid succession, his voice muffled through the tinted windows, but his gestures visible, sharp, agitated. The movements of a man whose playbook had been shredded and who was reaching for backup that might not exist. Kemp stood on the sidewalk with his clipboard hanging at his side and his face carrying the expression of a man undergoing a real-time professional crisis. The woman in the black coat, who Jace later learned was Walsh's legal coordinator, sat in the county car and made her own calls with the calm efficiency of someone already preparing to distance herself from whatever was about to happen. Boone used the 14 minutes. He sent Dutch and 2 Iron Vale riders to the building's rear entrance. He positioned Rusty near the main door. He called May inside the apartment. She answered on the first ring, her voice steady, Lena's voice audible in the background asking what was happening, and told her to lock the door and not open it for anyone who wasn't wearing a Black Vulture or Iron Vale patch. At 6:12 a.m., 2 county police cruisers arrived. The officers who stepped out were young, late 20s, maybe early 30s, and their body language communicated the particular tension of law enforcement arriving at a scene that doesn't fit any standard category. Motorcycle gang? Custody dispute? Property conflict? Their training had prepared them for each of these individually, not for all of them simultaneously. The senior officer approached Boone first. Name tape read, Morrison. "Someone want to tell me what's going on?" Walsh emerged from his SUV. "Officer, I'm Garrett Walsh with Ridgeline Property Management. I have a valid court order for the transfer of custody of a minor child from this building. These individuals are obstructing..." "He's lying." Jay stepped forward. His voice was clear, steady, carrying a conviction that surprised even him, because 6 hours ago he'd been sitting in a clubhouse learning that his brother might have been murdered, and now he was standing on a sidewalk at dawn telling a police officer the truth, with 26 bikers at his back. "He's been trying to evict me and my sister for weeks. He sent fake drug tips to CPS. He had a judge sign a midnight order without telling anyone. And his company..." Jace's voice cracked, but he pushed through it. "His company may have killed my brother." Morrison's eyes moved from Jace to Walsh to the line of motorcycles to Boone and back to Jace. His hand rested on his belt, not on his weapon, just on the belt, a neutral position that kept options open. "That's a significant accusation." "We have documentation," Slade said. He stepped forward with his phone. Financial records showing Ridgeline paid a motorcycle club to intimidate tenants out of properties across this county. Communication logs detailing the strategy. And physical evidence at a crash site on Route 81 that's inconsistent with the accident report filed for Ryder Mercer's death 3 weeks ago. Morrison looked at the phone, then at Walsh. The property man's composure had deteriorated visibly, sweat on his forehead despite the freezing temperature, rapid blinking, the micro-tremors of a man whose nervous system was processing the difference between a controlled operation and a catastrophic exposure. "I want these people removed from the premises," Walsh said. "They're trespassing. This is a public sidewalk," Morrison said. "Nobody's trespassing." He turned to his partner. "Call state police. Tell them we have a situation that may involve evidence in a death investigation." Walsh's face changed. The last layer of professional composure stripped away, revealing something underneath that was neither smooth nor reasonable. The raw, calculating expression of a man watching a structure he'd carefully built begin to collapse and searching for the single remaining support beam that could hold it up. He found it. "The custody order is valid," Walsh said. His voice had dropped the polished tone and picked up something harder, desperate. "Signed by Judge Calloway. Effective 6 a.m. If that child isn't produced for transfer, you're in violation of a court order. All of you." Morrison hesitated, because Walsh was right. Whatever else was happening, the files, the evidence, the death investigation, the custody order existed. It was signed. It was legal until a court said otherwise. And the clock had passed 6 a.m. 7 minutes ago. "Boone," Morrison turned to him. His voice carried genuine conflict. "I don't know what's in those files. I don't know what happened on Route 81, but I've got a signed order from a sitting judge. I can't ignore it." Boone stood on the sidewalk in the gray dawn light, with 26 men behind him, and a police officer in front of him, and a signed court order between him and the girl upstairs, and every single option he had was bad. Comply and lose Lena. Refuse and give Walsh the legal ammunition to paint the bikers as lawless obstructionists. Fight and destroy everything they'd built in the last 48 hours. He chose the fourth option, the one that didn't exist until he created it. "May," Boone said into his phone, "bring Lena down." Jace grabbed Boone's arm. No, you can't. Trust me." 2 words, spoken with the absolute conviction of a man who'd calculated 6 moves ahead and was betting everything on the sequence. Jace's hand stayed on Boone's arm. His fingers dug into the leather. His eyes searched Boone's face for the lie, the betrayal, the crack that would confirm his worst fear. That this was just another adult making promises he couldn't keep. He didn't find it. He let go. The building's front door opened. May walked out first, her gray hair catching the early light, her face set in an expression that communicated nothing to anyone who didn't know her and everything to the men who did. Behind her, Lena emerged into the cold wearing Ryder's flannel shirt and a pair of boots that were too big for her feet, walking with the rigid posture of a girl who understood she was being walked toward something terrible and had decided to face it standing. Kemp stepped forward reflexively, the trained response of a caseworker executing a court order. Boone held up one hand. "Wait." Kemp stopped. "Before you take this girl anywhere," Boone said, addressing Morrison now, not Walsh, not Kemp, only the officer with the badge and the authority and the conflict in his eyes, "I want it on record, on your body camera, on your partner's camera, on every recording device present, that May Callahan of 1847 Ridge Road, Mill Haven, filed a guardianship petition for Lena Mercer 3 hours ago with the family court clerk's emergency intake line. The petition is supported by documentation of stable housing, clean background, 22 years at the same address, and evidence that the current custody action was initiated through fraudulent means by a private company with financial interest in removing these children from their home." Morrison blinked. 3 hours ago? "Parker filed it at 3:17 a.m., Slade confirmed. He held up his phone showing the confirmation email. "The petition triggers an automatic review of any pending custody action under County Family Code Section 14-7. That review requires a 48-hour hold on enforcement of the existing order." Walsh lunged. "Not physically, verbally. That's not how it works. You can't just file a competing petition and freeze a judge's order." Section 14-7, paragraph C, Slade said. His voice was ice, flat, precise. The voice of a man who'd spent the small hours of the morning memorizing family code with a former intelligence officer's photographic retention. When a guardianship petition is filed concurrent with an active custody transfer order, the court is required to conduct a comparative review before enforcement proceeds. Standard hold is 48 hours. You know this, Mr. Walsh, or your legal team does. Morrison looked at his partner. His partner shrugged, the shrug of a patrol officer encountering family law nuances that existed well above his pay grade. I'm going to need to verify this, Morrison said. Verify it, Boone said. We'll wait. Morrison walked to his cruiser and made a call. The conversation lasted 4 minutes. During those 4 minutes, Jace stood on the sidewalk beside his sister and watched the sky lighten from charcoal to slate to the pale, exhausted gray of a winter morning that couldn't decide whether to commit to daylight. Lena's hand found his. Her fingers were freezing. He held on. Around them, 26 bikers stood in a perimeter that nobody had organized, but everyone understood. Not threatening, not aggressive, just present. A wall of leather and denim and scar tissue and old trauma arranged in a loose circle around 2 kids who'd been running out of ground to stand on until this morning. Morrison came back. His expression had changed. The conflict was still there, but it was joined by something else. Relief, maybe, or the particular satisfaction of a law enforcement officer who'd just been told by a county clerk that someone else would have to make the hard call. Section 14-7 applies, Morrison said. 48-hour hold on the custody transfer pending judicial review of the competing petition. He turned to Kemp. The order's on hold, David. You can't take the girl today. Kemp's shoulders dropped 2 inches. The tension left his body like air from a punctured tire. He nodded once, turned, and walked to the county car without looking at Walsh. Walsh stood alone on the sidewalk. The woman in the black coat was already in the car. Kemp was closing his door. The 2 police cruisers remained, but their presence had shifted from enforcement to observation. The bikers hadn't moved. The sky was getting lighter, and Walsh was standing in the middle of all of it with his charcoal overcoat and his leather portfolio and the slowly crystallizing understanding that the machine he'd built to crush 2 children had just been jammed by a collection of men he'd calculated would never cooperate long enough to matter. He looked at Boone. Something passed between them. Not words, not threats, just the raw recognition between 2 men who understood that this was not over. That 48 hours was a delay, not a victory. That the files in Slade's phone and the evidence on Route 81 and the guardianship petition and the state police inquiry were pieces on a board that both sides would continue to move until someone ran out of moves entirely. 48 hours, Walsh said. Quiet, almost to himself. He turned and walked to his SUV and opened the door and paused with one hand on the frame. You should know that Victor Dane doesn't lose. He's never played us, Boone said. Walsh got in the SUV. The engine started. The vehicle pulled away from the curb and turned left at the intersection and disappeared into the gray morning and left behind a silence that felt like the space between detonation and impact. The beat after the trigger is pulled, but before the round arrives. Lena was still holding Jace's hand. Her fingers hadn't loosened. She was looking at the spot where Walsh's SUV had been with an expression that carried more information than any words she could have spoken. Fury and fear, and the beginning of something that looked dangerously close to belief. Boone, Jace said. Boone looked at him. He said Victor Dane doesn't lose. Boone reached into his vest pocket and pulled out Walsh's business card, the one from the funeral, creased now, softened by body heat and miles. He looked at it for 3 seconds. Then he tore it in half and let the pieces fall to the frozen sidewalk. Ryder didn't lose either, Boone said. They just didn't let him finish. He turned to face the 26 men standing in the gray light of Decatur Street. Black Vulture and Iron Veil, 2 clubs with scars between them deep enough to see bone. Standing together on a sidewalk in front of a building that a dead man had defended with his reputation, his brotherhood, and eventually his life. 48 hours, Boone said. That's what we've got. In 48 hours, either May's guardianship petition is approved, the state police open an investigation into Ryder's death, and Ridgeline's operation gets exposed to every county official with a mailbox. Or Dane sends someone worse than Walsh and we lose these kids. He paused. looked at Decker. You in? Decker didn't hesitate. All the way? Harlan? The scarred man with the military haircut stepped forward from the Iron Veil line. I owe Ryder more than a plaque on a wall. Tell me where to stand. Boone looked at Dutch. The big man nodded once, the nod of a combat medic who'd spent his life arriving at the worst moment and staying until it passed. At Rusty, who was leaning against his bike near the building's entrance with his arms crossed, and his expression carrying the patient certainty of a man who'd been fixing broken things for 40 years and saw no reason to stop now. Then Boone looked at Jace. The boy stood on the sidewalk holding his sister's hand and his brother's memory and the weight of everything that had happened in the last 72 hours. The hunger and the rain and the helmet and the clubhouse and the food and the garage and the eviction and the CPS visit and the midnight ride and the confession and the brass plate and the dawn and the standoff and the 48-hour clock that was already ticking. He was 15 years old. He was exhausted. He was terrified. And he was not leaving. What do you need me to do? Jace asked. Boone studied the boy's face, searching for what Jace would never know. Maybe for Ryder, maybe for the ghost of a rider who'd stopped on a mountain pass to save a stranger and quit his club to protect his family and rode Route 81 on a wet night toward a guardrail that someone had decided would be his last mile. Whatever Boone found in Jace's face, it was enough. I need you to trust me for 48 more hours, Boone said. And then I need you to stand in front of a judge and tell them everything. Who you are. What happened. Why your brother died. He paused. The morning light caught the lines in his face and the gray in his beard and the particular darkness behind his eyes that came from carrying things too heavy for one man and refusing to put them down. Can you do that? Jace looked at Lena. His sister looked back at him, 14 years old, standing in boots too big for her feet and a dead man's flannel shirt and the freezing morning air of a life that had tried to crush her for 3 weeks and hadn't succeeded because she was still here. Still standing, still holding her brother's hand with fingers that had finally stopped shaking. She nodded. Jace turned back to Boone. 48 hours, he said. Then I finish what Ryder started. The 48 hours passed like a fever. Slade didn't sleep. He worked from the kitchen table at the Decatur apartment with 3 phones, a laptop borrowed from Parker's office, and a legal pad that filled with notes and handwriting so precise it looked machine-printed. Every hour produced new information. Every piece of information produced new calls. By noon on the first day, he'd mapped Ridgeline Property Management's corporate structure. 4 shell companies nested inside a holding group registered in another state, all tracing back to a single name, Victor Dane. By evening, he'd cross-referenced Ridgeline's property acquisitions with county eviction records and found the pattern: 12 buildings purchased below market value within 18 months, everyone cleared of tenants within 60 days of acquisition. Everyone resold at 3 to 5 times the purchase price. By midnight, Parker had assembled the guardianship petition into something that read less like a legal filing and more like an indictment. Boone coordinated from the clubhouse. He ran shifts, Black Vulture and Iron Veil riders rotating through the Decatur apartment in pairs, 4 hours on, 4 hours off, maintaining a visible presence that served as both protection and statement. The building's rear entrance was watched by Dutch, who sat in a folding chair with a thermos of coffee and the patient immobility of a man who'd spent entire deployments waiting for something to happen, and had long ago made peace with stillness. The front was covered by whoever was on rotation, scarred men in leather vests who stood on the sidewalk smoking cigarettes and saying nothing, their presence a language that required no translation. Nobody from Ridgeline came back. Not Walsh, not the building inspector, not the woman in the black coat. The county car didn't return. The silence from Victor Dane's side of the board was complete and absolute, and more unsettling than any threat, because silence from a man who didn't lose meant he was recalculating, not retreating. May stayed with Lena. She didn't leave the apartment for the full 48 hours. She cooked meals that Lena ate without being asked. She sat at the kitchen table while Lena did homework that was 3 weeks overdue. She slept on the couch with her phone on her chest and her boots on the floor beside her, positioned for speed. She didn't try to be Lena's mother, didn't try to be her friend. She occupied a space that had no name. the space between stranger and family, where trust is built not through conversation but through consistent, unremarkable presence. Lena watched her, constantly, with the careful, measuring gaze of a girl who'd been monitoring adults for signs of departure since she was old enough to understand that people leave. May passed every test by not taking them. She didn't perform loyalty, didn't announce her commitment, didn't make promises. She just stayed, and stayed, and stayed. On the second morning, Lena asked May how she liked her coffee. It was the first question she'd directed at anyone other than Jace since Ryder's death. May said black, 2 sugars, and Lena made it without another word and set it on the table and went back to her homework. The mug sat there steaming between them like a small, quiet treaty. Jace spent most of the 48 hours in the garage at Black Vulture with Rusty. Not because he was told to, because the garage was the only place where his brain stopped running calculations about timelines and court orders and the probability of outcomes that all terminated in separation or loss. In the garage, there was only the motorcycle and the tools and Rusty's hands moving with the unhurried precision of a man who believed that every broken thing could be fixed if you understood it well enough to know where it hurt. On the second afternoon, Rusty handed him a wrench. Bottom bolt, quarter turn, don't force it. Jace took the wrench. His hands were steadier now than they'd been 5 days ago. He found the bolt, turned it, felt the resistance give way with a soft click that traveled up through the handle and into his palm and settled somewhere in his chest like a heartbeat finding rhythm. Good, Rusty said. Nothing else. Just good. And went back to work. At 4:47 p.m. on the second day, 1 hour and 13 minutes before the hold expired, Parker called Boone. The judge is ready to hear the petition. Courtroom B, County Family Court, 6 o'clock. Boone relayed the information to Slade, who relayed it to Decker, who relayed it to his riders. Within 20 minutes, the machinery was in motion. Bikes starting, vests going on, the rolling coordination of men who'd spent decades moving as units and could execute a convergence without discussion. Jace rode to the courthouse with Boone. Lena rode with May in Slade's truck. They arrived at 5:38 p.m. and found the parking lot already occupied by motorcycles. 14 from Black Vulture, 11 from Iron Vale, lined up in rows that reflected the formation they'd held on Decatur Street. The riders stood beside their machines in the fading light, smoking and not talking, their breath clouding in the cold air like signals nobody was sending. The courthouse was a 2-story brick building with columns that had been white once and were now the gray of something that had given up on being maintained. Inside, the hallways smelled like floor wax and old paper, and the particular staleness of a building where decisions were made about people's lives by strangers in black robes who'd read a file but never stood inside the rooms those files described. Courtroom B was small. Wooden benches. A judge's bench elevated on a platform. 2 tables facing the front. Fluorescent lighting that hummed at a frequency designed to make everyone slightly uncomfortable. Parker was already there, a woman in her 40s with short brown hair and glasses, and the coiled energy of an attorney who'd been building a case for 48 hours on 3 hours of sleep and was ready to deploy it. Across the aisle, a man Jace had never seen sat at the opposing table. 50s. Silver hair. Expensive suit. A briefcase that probably cost more than the apartment on Decatur. Beside him, Walsh sat with his hands folded and his expression restored to its original professional smoothness, as though the dawn confrontation on the sidewalk had never happened. Behind them, in the back row of the gallery, sat a man in a dark overcoat who looked at nothing and said nothing and carried an aura of calculated patience that made the air around him feel colder. Jace didn't know his face, but the way Walsh turned to check that the man was there, the quick, reflexive glance of a subordinate confirming his superior's presence, told Jace everything. Victor Dane. The judge entered at 6:02 p.m. A woman in her 60s with steel gray hair pulled back severely and reading glasses that she put on and took off with a frequency that suggested she used them as punctuation rather than necessity. Her nameplate read Judge Patricia Kovac. She sat, arranged her papers, and looked at both tables with an expression that communicated she had been briefed on the complexity of this case and was not impressed by anyone in the room. This is a hearing on 2 matters. First, the emergency custody order filed by the county for Lena Mercer. Second, a competing guardianship petition filed by May Callahan. I've also received a formal request from the State Police Bureau of Investigation to preserve all records related to this case pending a criminal inquiry into Ridgeline Property Management. Kovac paused, removed her glasses, put them back on. That last item is unusual. I want both sides to understand that the presence of a criminal investigation changes the landscape of this proceeding significantly. Walsh's attorney, the silver-haired man, stood. Your Honor, the criminal inquiry is unrelated to the custody matter. The county's concern for these children's welfare is independent of any— Sit down, Mr. Hollins. I'll decide what's related. Hollins sat. Parker stood. Your Honor, the petitioner May Callahan is present. She meets all statutory requirements for emergency guardianship: stable residence, clean background, financial stability, and an established relationship with both children. Additionally, we provided the court with documented evidence that the original custody action was initiated at the direct request of Ridgeline Property Management, whose financial interest in vacating the children's home constitutes a conflict of interest that taints the entire proceeding. I've reviewed your filing, Kovac said. It's thorough. She turned to Hollins. Mr. Hollins, your client's position? Hollins stood again, buttoned his jacket, deployed the smooth, authoritative tone of a high-dollar attorney addressing a small county judge. Your Honor, the county's concern is straightforward. These children lack a legal guardian. The home is substandard. There is an open CPS investigation, including a drug allegation. Mrs. Callahan's petition, while admirable, was filed 48 hours ago by a woman with no familial connection to— Objection, Parker said. The drug allegation was an anonymous tip. CPS has found no evidence of drugs in the home. Additionally, we have documentation suggesting the tip was filed by or on behalf of Ridgeline Property Management as part of a coordinated campaign to— Your Honor, Hollins raised his voice, this is speculation. It's not speculation, Jace said. The courtroom went silent. Jace was standing. He hadn't planned to stand. His body had made the decision before his brain could evaluate it, rising from the bench behind Parker's table with the involuntary force of a person who'd listened to enough people talk about his life without including him in the conversation. Kovac looked at him. And you are? Jace Mercer. Ryder was my brother. Lena's my sister. I'm the one they're trying to get rid of. Jace, Parker started. Let him speak, Kovac said. Jace stood in the fluorescent light of courtroom B in clothes he'd been wearing for 2 days and sneakers that still carried dirt from the Iron Vale compound and his brother's helmet sitting on the bench beside where he'd been sitting. He looked at the judge and didn't think about what to say because thinking would have destroyed whatever was keeping him vertical. 3 weeks ago, my brother died on Route 81. The accident report says he lost control. But there are tire marks at that guardrail from a second vehicle, a vehicle that accelerated into the curve behind him. Nobody investigated that because nobody cared enough to look. He paused, swallowed. My brother used to ride with Iron Vale MC. He quit 3 years ago because he found out they were helping Ridgeline scare people out of their homes. He walked away from his club, his brothers, his life, everything, because he wouldn't be part of that. And then Ridgeline bought our building, and then my brother died on the road 3 miles from our front door. And then the same company started trying to take our home and separate me from my sister. He looked at Walsh. Walsh didn't meet his eyes. He looked at the man in the back row. Victor Dane sat motionless, watching. His expression was empty, not neutral, but empty. The vacancy of a person who'd learned to remove himself from the consequences of his decisions so completely that other people's pain registered as information rather than feeling. Jace looked back at the judge. You've got files from both sides and lawyers who know words I've never heard, and a system that's supposed to protect kids like us. Maybe it does sometimes. I don't know. But right now, the only people who've protected us are sitting in the parking lot on motorcycles. A woman named May filled our refrigerator and slept on our couch for 2 days. A man named Boone drove to our apartment at dawn and stood between my sister and a custody order that a real estate company bought at midnight. A mechanic named Rusty fixed our heater and handed me a wrench and taught me that broken things can be put back together if you're patient enough. His voice cracked. He let it. My brother's dead. I can't change that. But Lena's alive. I'm alive. And I'm asking you, Not as a file number or a case or a minor. I'm asking you as Ryder Mercer's brother to let May Callahan take care of us, because she's the first person in 3 weeks who showed up and stayed." The courtroom was still. Parker had tears on her face that she was making no effort to hide. Hollins was studying the table's surface. Walsh was studying his hands. And Victor Dane, in the back row, was studying Jace with an expression that had shifted from empty to something colder. The expression of a man recalculating a situation he'd expected to control and discovering that a 15-year-old boy standing in dirty sneakers had just changed the arithmetic. Kovac removed her glasses. "Put them down." Didn't pick them back up. "Sit down, Mr. Mercer." Jace sat. Kovac was quiet for a long time. Long enough for the fluorescent hum to become the only sound in the room. Long enough for Jace to count his own heartbeats. 14, before the judge spoke again. "I'm granting the guardianship petition. May Callahan is appointed temporary guardian of Jace and Lena Mercer, effective immediately, pending a full review in 90 days. She looked at Hollins. "The emergency custody order is vacated. The CPS case will be reviewed in light of the state police inquiry into the referring party's motives." She paused. "Mr. Hollins, I'd advise your clients to make themselves available for that inquiry. All of them." She looked at the back row. Victor Dane was already standing, already moving toward the door. His overcoat brushed against the wooden bench as he turned, and for 1 second, less than a second, a fraction of a beat, his eyes met Jace's. Nothing passed between them that could be called communication, just the mutual recognition between a man who operated systems and a boy who'd just survived one. Dane walked out. Walsh followed. Hollins gathered his briefcase and left without shaking anyone's hand. The courtroom emptied slowly. Parker shook Jace's hand and then hugged him, which he didn't expect and didn't resist. May walked forward from the gallery where she'd been sitting and stood in front of Lena and didn't say anything, and Lena didn't say anything, and then Lena stepped forward and pressed her face into May's shoulder, and her hands grabbed the fabric of May's jacket, and she held on. Boone was leaning against the wall near the courtroom door. He'd been there the whole time. Jace hadn't seen him come in. The man stood with his arms crossed and his eyes on the floor and his jaw working in that slow, rhythmic way that meant he was processing something too large for stillness but too deep for movement. When Jace walked past him, Boone reached out and put his hand on the boy's shoulder. Didn't squeeze, didn't pull him close, just rested it there, the weight of a calloused palm on a 15-year-old shoulder, and held it for 5 seconds. "Ryder would have been proud of you," Boone said. Jace didn't trust himself to respond. He nodded and walked through the courthouse doors into the cold evening air, where 25 motorcycles sat in the parking lot and the men who rode them stood in the fading light, waiting. Decker was the first to approach. He walked across the parking lot and stopped in front of Jace and looked at the boy with an expression that carried the full weight of 3 years of guilt compressed into a face that had aged visibly in the past 48 hours. "What you said in there," Decker started. "I meant it." "I know you did." Decker's hands were at his sides. His vest carried the president's patch, but his posture carried something else. The deflated authority of a man who understood that leadership without integrity is just management. "I failed your brother. The club failed him. Nothing I say changes that." "No," Jace said. "It doesn't." Decker nodded, accepting, not asking for more. "But he'd want you to fix what you broke," Jace continued. "Not for him, for the other people. The 47 tenants you scared out of their homes. They had lives too." Decker looked at Jace for a long time. Then he turned to Harlan, who was standing 3 feet behind him with his hands in his pockets, and his scarred face carrying an expression that was almost, not quite, but almost, something resembling hope. "Start a list," Decker said. "Every tenant, every property, every person we displaced. I want names and addresses." "That's going to take..." "I don't care how long it takes. Start the list." The evening unfolded in stages that Jace would remember not as a sequence, but as a collection of images burned into his memory with the permanence of Ryder's name on that brass plate. The ride back to the clubhouse. Lena in the truck with May, Jace behind Boone, the convoy splitting at the Route 81 junction, Iron Veil turning north toward their compound, Black Vulture continuing south toward Millhaven. At the split, Decker pulled alongside Boone at the intersection. The two men looked at each other across 2 feet of cold air and 4 years of history, and whatever they communicated in that look was enough, because Decker extended his hand and Boone took it, and they shook once. Not the performative grip of politicians, but the brief, firm clasp of men acknowledging a debt that had been partially paid and would take years to settle. The clubhouse. Warm, loud in a way that felt earned rather than performed. Someone had started the grill behind the building despite the freezing temperature, and the smell of cooking meat mixed with cigarette smoke and engine grease, and the particular warmth of bodies filling a space that had been built for exactly this. The gathering of broken people into a room where brokenness wasn't a deficiency, but a credential. May in the kitchen, cooking with the methodical efficiency of a woman who expressed love through the production of food and saw no reason to explain the translation. Lena beside her, not helping exactly, more like occupying adjacent space, her hand occasionally reaching for something May needed before May asked for it, the two of them developing a rhythm that had no choreography but found its own pattern. Rusty in the corner by the jukebox, drinking coffee from a mug that said, "World's okayest mechanic." A gift, Jace would later learn, from a man who died 6 years ago and whose name Rusty never mentioned but whose mug he used every single day. Dutch at the bar, his single eye watching the room with the steady surveillance of a man who'd appointed himself guardian of this specific perimeter and would maintain that post until someone physically removed him. Slade on the phone. Always on the phone, coordinating with Parker, with the state police, with county officials who were suddenly very interested in Ridgeline property management now that a judge had publicly referenced a criminal inquiry. And Boone, sitting at the end of the bar with a whiskey he wasn't drinking, his eyes moving across the room with an expression that Jace couldn't read until much later, when he'd learned enough about the man to understand that Boone's version of happiness looked exactly like everything else. Controlled, measured, contained. But present. Unmistakably present. Jace sat on the cracked leather couch, the same couch he'd sat on 5 days ago, soaking wet and starving, holding a dead man's helmet and offering to sell it for $5. The leather was warm now. The room was warm. The helmet sat beside him, the Iron Veil Rider's decal catching the light from the bar's amber fixtures, and for the first time since Ryder's death, looking at it didn't feel like looking at a wound. It felt like looking at a map. A record of where his brother had been and what he'd stood for, and why he'd made the choices he made. Lena appeared from the kitchen carrying 2 mugs of coffee. She handed one to Jace and sat beside him on the couch. Her feet didn't reach the floor. She tucked them beneath her and held the mug with both hands and blew on the surface and watched the steam curl upward and disappear into the permanent cloud of smoke that lived above shoulder height. "May makes bad coffee," Lena said. "Yeah. I told her I'd teach her." Jace looked at his sister. She was almost smiling, not fully. The muscles weren't ready for that yet. But the architecture of a smile was there. The slight lift at the corners of her mouth, the softening around her eyes, the faint relaxation of the jaw that had been clenched for 3 weeks. "She'd probably let you," Jace said. "She already said yes." They sat together on the cracked leather couch and drank bad coffee and listened to the sounds of the clubhouse, the music rolling through blown speakers, the murmur of conversations that carried no urgency, the occasional burst of laughter that rose and fell like something natural. Outside, the cold pressed against the windows with the same persistence it had shown all week, but inside the walls held, and the heater worked, and the people filling the room had no intention of leaving. Later that night, much later, after most of the food was gone and the music had softened and the conversations had settled into the low, comfortable register of people who'd been through something together and survived, Boone walked to the memorial wall at the back of the clubhouse. Jace watched him from the couch. The wall was covered with names, riders lost to roads, to wars, to time, to the accumulated weight of lives lived at high speed on hard surfaces. Each name etched or burned into metal plates that reflected the dim light with the dull warmth of things that had been touched by many hands over many years. Boone pulled a soldering iron from behind the bar, the same kind Decker had used at Iron Veil. He plugged it in and waited while it heated, standing before the wall with the patience of a man performing an act he considered sacred in the only way he knew how. Through fire and metal and the slow, deliberate application of heat to a surface that would carry the mark permanently. He burned 2 lines into a new brass plate. The first line was a name, Ryder Mercer. The second line was beneath it, smaller, in letters that trembled slightly at their edges, the way handwriting trembles when the person writing is holding back something that wants to escape through their hands. Family rides forever. Boone mounted the plate on the wall, stepped back, looked at it. Jace crossed the room. He stood beside Boone and looked at his brother's name on a wall, surrounded by the names of men he'd never met who'd ridden the same roads and survived the same wars and died in the same ways, violently, quietly, alone, surrounded, too young, too old, before they were ready. "He should have been here," Jace said. Boone was quiet for a while. The soldering iron cooled on the bar behind them, ticking softly as the metal contracted. "He is," Boone said. The state police opened a formal investigation into Ridgeline Property Management the following week. Victor Dane's assets were frozen pending the inquiry. Garrett Walsh turned cooperating witness within 72 hours of the court hearing, trading testimony for consideration in a way that surprised nobody who understood how men like Walsh operated, loyal to the structure until the structure couldn't protect them, then loyal to whoever could. The Route 81 crash site was re-examined by state forensic investigators. The second set of tire marks was documented, photographed, and entered into evidence. The guardrail was finally repaired. Someone, nobody took credit, but Jace suspected Harlan, placed a small metal cross at the mile marker where Ryder died, and the cross remained through winter and spring and into the following summer, weathering but never falling, anchored in the frozen dirt by hands that understood permanence. May's temporary guardianship became permanent at the 90-day review. The hearing lasted 11 minutes. Kovacs signed the order and looked at Jace over her glasses and said, "You're going to be fine, Mr. Mercer." And Jace said, "Yes, ma'am," and meant it in a way he couldn't have meant it 3 months earlier. They moved into May's house on Ridge Road, a 2-story with a covered porch and a detached garage, and a kitchen that May had already rearranged to accommodate 2 teenagers she'd known for less than a week when she volunteered to take them in. Lena got her own room, the first she'd ever had, with a window that looked out over the road where motorcycles passed on their way to and from the clubhouse. Jace's room was across the hall, smaller, with a desk where he did homework and a shelf where Ryder's helmet sat beside a photograph of the 3 of them, Ryder, Jace, Lena, taken at a gas station on Route 81 2 years earlier, all of them squinting into the sun, none of them knowing what was coming. Jace kept going to the garage. Every afternoon after school, Rusty never invited him and never turned him away. The old mechanic taught him engines the way engines should be taught, through silence and repetition, and the gradual accumulation of understanding that comes from putting your hands on broken things and learning how they fit back together. By spring, Jace could rebuild a carburetor without guidance. By summer, he was helping Rusty with full engine teardowns, working side by side in a quiet that communicated more than any conversation either of them would have been comfortable having. One afternoon in April, Rusty handed him a set of keys. "What's this?" "The 74 Shovelhead, the one your brother rebuilt." Rusty wiped his hands on a rag and pushed his glasses up on his forehead. "It's been sitting in the back bay since he brought it in. He asked me to hold it for him, never came back for it." Jace looked at the keys in his palm, small, cold, carrying the weight of a machine his brother had resurrected from a crate of parts that didn't even come from the same decade. "I can't ride yet," Jace said. "No," Rusty agreed, "but you can learn to take care of it until you can." Jace closed his fingers around the keys. The metal warmed in his hand. He put them in his pocket and went back to work. And Rusty went back to work. And the radio hissed between stations, and the afternoon light came through the garage bay door in long golden rectangles that stretched across the oil-stained concrete floor, like roads leading somewhere neither of them needed to name. On the last Saturday of that month, Jace sat on the porch at May's house, watching the sun go down behind the ridge. The air was warm for the first time in months. Not summer warm, just the tentative warmth of early spring when the earth is still deciding whether to commit. Lena was inside making coffee with May, and through the open kitchen window, Jace could hear them talking. Actually talking, not just the functional exchanges of cohabitation, but the layered, overlapping conversation of two people who'd found a rhythm together and were comfortable enough to let it meander. Boone's bike appeared on Ridge Road. The sound of the engine preceded the machine itself. A low, rolling bass note that Jace recognized before the headlight crested the hill. Boone pulled into the driveway, killed the engine, and sat on the bike for a moment looking at the house. Then he dismounted and walked up the porch steps and sat in the chair beside Jace without being invited. They watched the last light fade behind the mountains. State police made an arrest yesterday, Boone said, a driver who worked for one of Dane's subcontractors. They found the vehicle, damage consistent with side impact on the passenger quarter panel. Jace didn't speak. He'd known this was coming, had known since Harlan's words in the Iron Vale clubhouse that the second set of tire marks meant something, that something had a name, and that name would eventually be spoken in a room with a judge and a file and a charge that reduced his brother's death from a mystery to a crime. They're charging him, Boone said, the driver, and they're building a case against Dane for ordering it. Jace nodded. His throat was tight. His eyes burned. But the tears that came weren't the same tears he'd been fighting since the night in the apartment when Lena sat on the kitchen floor and wouldn't look at him. These were different, cleaner, carrying something that had been locked inside his chest for months and was only now finding the exit. He cried, quietly. On a porch in early spring with a man he'd known for 3.5 months sitting beside him in a silence that asked nothing and offered everything. Boone didn't touch him, didn't speak, just sat in the chair with his hands on his knees and his eyes on the mountains and the steady, unhurried breathing of a man who understood that some things can only be processed through the body and that the most useful thing another person can do is stay present while it happens. When it passed, and it did pass, gradually, like weather moving through, Jace wiped his face with the back of his hand and sat back in the chair and breathed. He didn't die for nothing, Jace said. No, Boone said. He didn't. The kitchen window was still open. Inside, Lena laughed. The sound was brief and quiet and imperfect, more a release of tension than humor. But it traveled through the window and across the porch and into the spring air where it mixed with the cooling engine of Boone's motorcycle and the faint scent of coffee and the distant sound of traffic on Route 81. Jace listened to his sister laugh. And in that sound, small, fragile, real, he heard something he'd been afraid to listen for since the night he walked into the Black Vulture clubhouse with a dead man's helmet and $5 worth of desperation. He heard the future, not the one that had been stolen, not the one the system tried to impose. The one being built, piece by piece, in a garage, and a kitchen, and a courtroom, and a porch, by people who'd found each other in the dark and decided to stay. On the shelf in his room, Ryder's helmet sat beside the photograph. The Iron Vale Rider's decal caught the evening light through the window. The rattlesnake, the crossed pistons, the faded paint and the cracked visor and the scratches that told a story only the man who'd worn it could fully read. But Jace was learning, one bolt at a time, one afternoon at a time, one breath at a time. Healing didn't mean forgetting. It meant finding people willing to sit beside your pain until you could carry it yourself. And then, when you were ready, when the engine was rebuilt and the road was dry and the morning was clear, it meant riding forward, with the helmet on, with the ghost in the wind, with the family that chose you when the world didn't. And somewhere on Route 81, where a guardrail had been repaired and a metal marker stood in dirt that had finally thawed, the wind carried the smell of asphalt and gasoline and the first warmth of a season that had taken its time arriving. Spring, finally, after the longest winter.